At Halston's charity gala, 15-year-old Noah Bennett was accused of stealing the library's most valuable book. They dragged him forward. Everyone watched in silence.
You were trusted here.
Conrad wanted a confession.
What did you think would happen?
Noah refused to lie.
I did not steal it.
The room believed Conrad.
Then explain why you were hiding it.
But Noah had found it.
I found it in a crate.
Because the original was missing.
The original never left this library.
Then Evelyn stepped forward.
Don't let them take that book!
She knew the truth. The displayed book was fake.
The book under glass is a forgery.
Conrad finally looked afraid.
Be careful what you accuse me of.
He did not steal history. He found what you buried.
To understand why, go back 6 weeks. 6 weeks earlier, the Halston Heritage Library had not yet become the center of a scandal. It was still only an old public building on the east side of the city, standing between a bus station and a row of stores that changed owners every few years. Its limestone walls were stained by decades of rain. Its copper roof had darkened almost black. In winter, the pipes groaned beneath the floorboards, and in summer, the upper reading room carried the warm scent of dust, cedar shelves, old paper, and leather bindings that had survived longer than most of the people who once touched them. To wealthy people driving past in black cars, the library looked tired. It occupied valuable land near the river, close to luxury apartments, boutique hotels, and polished glass towers that had begun changing Halston beyond recognition. To developers, it was a property with potential. To city officials, it was a budget problem. To men like Conrad Vale, it was an opportunity waiting to be renamed. But to the people who used it every day, the library was something else entirely. Children came after school because it was quiet, safe, and warm. Older men came because they had nowhere else to sit after retirement. Mothers came to use the computers for job applications. Teenagers came to study, read, hide from arguments at home, or simply spend a few hours in a place where no one expected them to explain why life had become difficult. The library did not ask for proof of income. It did not care where a person slept. It did not demand that anyone explain their past before opening its doors. That was why Evelyn Hart had stayed there for so long. At 57, Evelyn had become the kind of woman people overlooked until they needed something only she could find. She was not loud. She did not dress to be noticed. Her gray-brown hair was always pinned neatly behind her head, and she wore thin cotton gloves whenever she handled old paper. Her clothes were simple, practical, and slightly old-fashioned. She moved through the archive rooms with careful, measured steps, as though every shelf held a memory that deserved respect. Officially, Evelyn was the library's senior archival assistant. It was a title that made her sound like someone who spent her days dusting books and filing records. In truth, she knew more about Halston's history than most of the men who gave speeches about it. She could identify a forged signature by the pressure of the ink. She could tell the age of a document by the fibers in its paper. She knew which streets had vanished beneath new construction, which neighborhoods had been renamed by investors, and which public promises had disappeared the moment money changed hands. Evelyn had built her life around those small traces, because 20 years earlier, she had learned what happened when powerful people believed they could erase them. Before coming to the library, Evelyn had been a forensic auditor for the city of Halston. She had worked in the municipal finance office, reviewing redevelopment budgets, public grants, housing contracts, and infrastructure programs. She had been good at her work. Too good, perhaps, for people who preferred financial reports to remain unread. At the time, Halston had been changing quickly. Old neighborhoods near the river were being cleared for redevelopment. Public housing projects were being repaired, relocated, or quietly abandoned. New foundations appeared every year, promising to rebuild struggling communities. Politicians praised private investment. Newspapers printed photographs of smiling developers standing beside ribbon cuttings and construction sites. One of those developers was Conrad Vale. Even then, Conrad had known how to make ambition sound like compassion. He was younger, hungrier, and far less famous than he would become. But the city already admired him. He spoke about restoring dignity to forgotten neighborhoods. He donated coats during winter drives. He appeared at school fundraisers. He made people feel that Halston's future depended on men like him. Evelyn had not disliked him at first. She had only followed the numbers. The more she reviewed the finances connected to the city's redevelopment programs, the more she noticed patterns that made no sense. Public funds intended for housing repairs were being transferred into charitable accounts. Those accounts paid consulting fees to private firms. The firms were connected to contractors. The contractors were connected to land purchases. The land purchases eventually led back to companies linked to Conrad Vale and his earliest business partners. Nothing had been stolen in one obvious act. That was what made the scheme so difficult to see. The money moved in fragments. It passed through foundations with hopeful names. It was hidden inside consulting contracts, administrative costs, redevelopment fees, and emergency transfers. Each transaction looked harmless by itself. But when Evelyn placed them beside one another, a pattern appeared. Public money was being used to help private interests control public land. Evelyn needed proof before she could report it. She needed someone who understood the city's old records, someone who knew where the original deeds and transfer documents had been stored. That person was Arthur Bennett. Arthur had been a municipal records clerk, quiet, patient, and almost invisible to the people who worked above him. He had no powerful friends. He had no political ambition. He was the kind of man who remembered the exact shelf where a file had been placed 15 years earlier, even after 3 office moves and 2 changes in the archive system. Arthur had recognized the same irregularities Evelyn had found. Several land transfer records had been altered. Dates had been changed. Property classifications had shifted after signatures were supposedly completed. Documents had appeared in folders where they did not belong. Some records carried seals that had not existed at the dates printed on them. Together, Evelyn and Arthur had come close to exposing the truth. Then the documents began disappearing. Before Evelyn could deliver her final report, she was accused of manipulating city financial records. The same spreadsheets she had used to uncover fraud were suddenly presented as evidence against her. Money that had vanished through a complicated network of transfers was blamed on her department. The city needed someone to absorb the scandal, and Evelyn was convenient. She was not wealthy. She was not politically connected. She had no family name that could frighten the people accusing her. Arthur tried to defend her. He submitted notes about altered deeds and missing evidence. He insisted that files had been removed from the archive system. But his warnings were dismissed as paranoia. He was removed from his job. His reputation was damaged. Within months, the city had painted Evelyn as a dishonest auditor, and Arthur as a troubled clerk, unable to accept the conclusions of the investigation. Conrad Vale survived untouched. In fact, he emerged stronger. Over the next 2 decades, his company grew. Vale Horizons built luxury towers, shopping centers, private hospitals, and waterfront districts. Conrad funded scholarships. He donated to museums. He sponsored youth programs. His name appeared on plaques across the city. And Evelyn disappeared. She took temporary work restoring documents. She cataloged private collections. She repaired damaged books. Eventually, the Halston Heritage Library hired her because old paper did not care what the newspapers had once said about her. The library was one of the few places where she could work without hearing whispers whenever she entered a room. For 20 years, Evelyn had not tried to fight her past. She had survived it. Then Conrad Vale announced that he wanted to save the library. The proposal arrived with headlines, television interviews, and photographs of Conrad standing beneath the library's stone archway, while promising a new future for Halston's children. Vale Horizons would invest $40 million into a modern educational complex called the Vale Center for Tomorrow. The plan included a technology wing, a media lab, a scholarship center, a renovated children's library, and a sleek glass structure extending toward the river. The city celebrated before most people read the details. The mayor praised Conrad's generosity. The library board called it a miracle. Newspapers described the project as a lifeline for an aging institution that could no longer survive on public funding alone. People who had never visited the library suddenly had opinions about how it should be transformed. But Evelyn saw what the others did not. The agreement required the city to lease the library property to Vale Horizons for 99 years. The library itself would remain open, at least in theory. But much of the surrounding land would be converted into private retail space, corporate offices, luxury cafes, and event halls. The old building would become the decorative center of a much larger commercial project. It would survive as an image, not as a promise. Evelyn understood the danger immediately. A public library did not belong to the city officials who happened to manage it. It belonged to the people who needed it. And once the land was given to a private company for nearly a century, there would be no easy way to take it back. She began studying the legal documents late at night. Most of the agreement had been carefully written by expensive lawyers. But near the end of the planning folder, hidden behind technical maps and development schedules, Evelyn found an amendment dated 1978. It claimed that the original terms of the library's founding agreement had been changed decades earlier, allowing the city to transfer the property for private development under certain conditions. At first glance, the document looked convincing. The language was formal. The seal appeared official. The pages were yellowed enough to suggest age. The signatures looked authentic. It was exactly the sort of paper most people accepted without question, because it looked old and complicated. But Evelyn had spent too long studying the small places where lies failed. The seal at the bottom of the amendment belonged to a municipal archive classification system created in 1986. The paper contained a fiber blend that had not been used in city documents during the 1970s. The typeface was correct for the era, but the spacing between lines matched a template introduced years later. The document claimed to have been filed in 1978, yet the reference number followed a code system that did not exist until the late 80s. Someone had created an old lie using new tools. That night, Evelyn sat alone in her small apartment on Grant Street, surrounded by copied documents and handwritten notes. Trucks rumbled below her window. The laundromat downstairs had closed hours earlier, leaving the building quiet except for the low hum of old machines. A mug of tea cooled beside her lamp, as she compared the forged amendment to real city records. The more she studied it, the more certain she became. Someone was trying to steal the library without calling it theft. The next morning, Evelyn brought her findings to Martin Gage, the library director. Martin was not a bad man. He had spent years trying to keep the library open through funding cuts, staff reductions, and public indifference. He had the tired face of someone who had learned to celebrate every small victory because larger victories no longer seemed possible. Evelyn explained the inconsistencies. She showed him the mismatched archive seal. She pointed out the paper fibers, the date problem, and the wrong filing system. Martin listened. He looked uneasy. He turned the pages slowly. Then he told her that the city legal department had already approved the agreement. Conrad Vale's team had spent months preparing the proposal. The library board had accepted the documents as legitimate. Martin suggested that Evelyn might be viewing the situation through the pain of what had happened to her years earlier. He did not accuse her of lying. That would have been easier. Instead, he implied that her past had made her suspicious of everything. Evelyn left his office without arguing. Downstairs, in the reading room, Noah Bennett was sorting returned books onto a cart. He was 15, thin, dark-haired, and taller than people expected when they first saw him. His clothes were clean but worn. The sleeves of his jacket had frayed at the cuffs, and his shoes had been repaired with black tape near the soles. Noah had been coming to the library for nearly a year. He lived in a foster home on the other side of Halston, with a couple who were doing their best, but already had too many responsibilities. There were other children in the house, too many rules, and not enough quiet. Noah had moved through 4 placements in 6 years. He had learned not to unpack fully. He had learned not to ask whether a room was really his. He had learned that adults often said they wanted honesty, but only when honesty was easy to hear. At the library, no one asked him to explain himself. He volunteered after school. He organized donations, repaired loose book covers, helped older patrons use the computers, and spent hours reading local history. He liked maps, old newspapers, photographs, land records, and anything that revealed how the city had become what it was. He liked history, because history proved that people had existed even when the world tried to forget them. Evelyn had noticed him long before they became friends. At first, Noah had been another quiet boy sitting alone near the window. But then he began asking questions that surprised her. He wanted to know why old books sometimes had handwritten notes in the margins. He wanted to know why city maps showed streets that no longer existed. He wanted to know who decided what was worth preserving. One afternoon, Noah brought Evelyn a small brass key. It was heavy for its size, with a worn oval head and a symbol engraved near the shaft. The symbol looked like a lantern inside a circle. Noah explained that the key had belonged to his grandfather, Arthur Bennett. It was one of only 2 things Noah had left from him, along with an old photograph. When Evelyn looked at the photograph, the past reached out and took hold of her. Arthur Bennett stood beside a younger woman in an office filled with file boxes and folders. The woman wore a navy blouse and had dark hair pulled back from her face. She looked focused, determined, and far less tired than Evelyn remembered feeling during those years. The woman was Evelyn. For several seconds, she could not speak. Noah had never known the full story about his grandfather. He only knew that Arthur had worked for the city, had always spoken about truth, and had died before Noah was old enough to understand why adults avoided mentioning his name. Evelyn turned the brass key over in her gloved hand. The lantern symbol belonged to an old archival system. Before Halston digitized most sensitive records, certain files had been stored in locked cabinets beneath the library. The cabinet numbers were rarely listed in public records. Only longtime municipal employees knew they existed. That evening, after the public rooms closed, Evelyn took Noah down to the lower archive level. The basement corridor was narrow and cold. The lights hummed overhead. The stone walls carried the scent of damp paper and old dust. At the far end of the hallway stood several metal cabinets that had not been opened in years. Most were rusted. Some were sealed with outdated evidence labels. One cabinet bore the same lantern symbol as Noah's key, almost hidden beneath layers of paint. Noah placed the key in the lock. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the mechanism turned. Inside, they found a cardboard box tied with brittle twine, several reels of microfilm, a packet of photographs, and a sealed envelope with Arthur Bennett's name written across the front in faded blue ink. Evelyn knew she should have contacted the city archives office immediately. She knew the rules. She knew the procedure. But when she saw Arthur's handwriting, she could not treat the moment like routine paperwork. The envelope contained a letter Arthur had written shortly before his death. It did not include a dramatic confession. It did not name every person involved. Arthur had been too careful for that. Instead, he wrote about fear. He wrote that the evidence they had found had been scattered, altered, and hidden in places no one would think to search. He wrote that Conrad Vale had never feared truth as much as he feared connections. A single document could be dismissed. A witness could be discredited. But if the old records were placed beside one another, they would reveal what had been done. Arthur believed the truth was still alive. It had simply been buried beneath the things powerful people considered worthless. At the bottom of the letter, he had left a sequence of dates, symbols, and file references. Evelyn recognized the system immediately. They were cross-references to municipal filings, redevelopment ledgers, library trust records, and financial documents connected to a charitable foundation that no longer officially existed. The name on the foundation was Vale Community Futures. It was one of Conrad Vale's first philanthropic organizations. Over the following days, Evelyn and Noah worked quietly. Noah helped copy reference codes, organize old files, and compare public records with the materials Arthur had left behind. He did not complain about the boring work. He had Arthur's patience in him, though he did not yet understand how deeply his grandfather had shaped him. Together, they found proof that the library land had never belonged to the city in the ordinary way. The property had been donated in 1912 by Margaret Halston, whose family had funded the original building. Her founding trust included a condition that had slowly disappeared from public summaries over the decades. The land had been given for permanent community use. It could not be sold, leased, transferred, or converted into a private commercial project. If the city ever attempted to do so, ownership would automatically revert to an independent public trust established by Margaret Halston herself. The entire Vale Horizons project depended on that condition remaining hidden, and the condition was recorded inside the original Founders Register. The Founders Register was an enormous leather-bound ledger stored in the library's climate-controlled vault. It contained the names of the original trustees, the first donations, the land agreement, and Margaret Halston's handwritten founding conditions. 3 days after Evelyn and Noah discovered the clause, the library board announced that the Founders Register would be displayed as the centerpiece of the upcoming Halston Heritage Gala. The gala was being promoted as a celebration of the library's future. Conrad Vale would be honored as the man who had saved the building. Donors, politicians, reporters, and business leaders would gather beneath the stained glass ceiling. The original register would be placed under glass as a symbol of the library's history and its bright new beginning. Evelyn read the announcement twice. Then she went to the vault. The Founder's Register was still on its shelf. At first, she almost felt relieved. The leather cover was the right color. The gold lettering appeared worn. The binding carried the same floral pattern. Everything looked exactly as it should. But Evelyn had handled the original register twice before in her career, and she remembered one small detail no copy could easily imitate. Near the lower corner of the true cover was a dark water stain left by the flood of 1947. The book in the vault had no stain. Evelyn stood perfectly still. Someone had already replaced the original. And somewhere inside Halston, Conrad Vale now had the one document that could destroy everything he was trying to build. Evelyn did not touch the false register again until she had taken photographs of every detail that proved it was a replacement. She photographed the smooth lower corner where the flood stain should have been. She photographed the stitching along the spine, too even and too clean for a book more than a century old. She photographed the pages under angled light, revealing fibers that did not match paper made in 1912. Then she went to Martin Gage one last time. This time she did not arrive with a theory. She arrived with evidence. Martin listened behind the closed door of his office, while Evelyn laid the photographs across his desk. Outside, the library remained busy. Children moved through the reading room. A printer hummed near the public computers. Someone laughed softly near the circulation counter. The ordinary sounds made the conversation feel even more unreal. Evelyn explained that the Founder's Register in the vault was not genuine. She explained that the true book contained the original land condition, preventing the library property from being leased for private development. She showed him the forged amendment from 1978 and the archive details that proved it had been created years later. Martin did not deny that the evidence looked troubling, but he was afraid of what the truth would cost. The gala was only days away. Conrad Vale's foundation had already paid for the event. City officials had confirmed their attendance. Newspapers had promised coverage. The library board had built its entire future around the announcement of the Vale Center for tomorrow. If Evelyn was right, the project would not merely be delayed, it could collapse completely. Martin told her that accusing Conrad Vale without official proof would be reckless. He warned that the board would see her actions as sabotage. He said that the city could not survive another public scandal involving the library. Evelyn understood what he was really saying. He believed the library needed Conrad more than it needed the truth. That afternoon, she was placed on administrative suspension. The letter was written in polite language. It claimed that she had accessed restricted material without authorization and caused unnecessary disruption during an important institutional transition. She was instructed not to enter the archive rooms until further notice. For the second time in her life, Evelyn watched a powerful system turn procedure into punishment. The first time, she had been younger. She had still believed that someone would eventually step in and ask what had truly happened. This time, she knew better. She did not argue. She gathered her gloves, her notebook, and the few personal items she kept in her archive drawer. Then she walked through the library without saying goodbye to anyone. Most of the staff avoided looking at her. A few looked sorry. None of them stopped her. That was the part Evelyn would remember most clearly. Not the suspension letter, not Martin's fear, not even the knowledge that Conrad Vale had found a way to rewrite history inside the very building meant to preserve it. What she remembered was how easy it had been for people to remain silent when silence protected them. Noah learned about Evelyn's suspension the following day. He had arrived after school carrying a stack of returned books, unaware that he was no longer supposed to be there. The circulation desk employee told him quietly that his volunteer access had been paused. She would not explain why. At first, Noah thought it was because of Evelyn. Then the security supervisor approached him with a rare 19th century atlas in his hands. The atlas had been found beneath the table where Noah usually studied. It was one of the most valuable items in the special collection. Its pages were delicate, its maps hand-colored, and its cover embossed with the seal of the old Halston Survey Office. It should never have been left in the public reading room. Yet there it was, beneath Noah's chair, as though someone had placed it there specifically to be discovered. Noah said he had never touched it. The supervisor did not accuse him directly. He did something more damaging. He made it clear that the library could no longer trust him around valuable materials. Noah stood in the lobby holding the volunteer badge he had worn for almost a year. Around him, people continued walking past the front desk. Some glanced at him. Most did not. He knew what they saw. A foster kid with worn shoes. A quiet boy without parents beside him. Someone easy to blame because people already believed he probably had a reason to take what did not belong to him. By the end of the day, Noah had been barred from volunteering. He did not tell Evelyn immediately. He waited until evening, then went to her apartment on Grant Street, carrying the suspension letter from the library and the brass key that had belonged to Arthur Bennett. Rain had soaked the shoulders of his jacket. His hair clung to his forehead. He tried to act as though the letter did not matter, but Evelyn saw the way he held it. The library had been one of the only places where Noah had felt wanted without being examined. It had been a place where he could sit beside other people without worrying about whether they knew his history. A place where he could be useful. A place where his questions were welcomed. Now it had become another door closing in his face. Evelyn wanted to tell him that none of this was his fault, but she knew those words would not be enough. Instead, she showed him the evidence she had copied before leaving the archive. The photographs of the fake register, the forged 1978 amendment, Arthur's letter, the notes about the hidden land condition. She told him that the people responsible wanted both of them out of the way because they were getting too close. Noah listened without interrupting. Then he asked the question Evelyn had been trying not to ask herself. If Conrad Vale had taken the real register, where had he put it? The answer came the following morning. Noah had gone behind the library to throw away a bag of old newspapers for his foster mother. Near the recycling bins, he noticed several boxes from Vale Community Futures stacked beside the loading dock. Most were empty packaging from gala decorations, but one crumpled sheet of paper had blown loose from the top of a bin. It was a delivery manifest. The document listed several crates scheduled to arrive before the Halston Heritage Gala. One crate was marked as historical display material. Another carried a more private label, archival handling, restricted access. At the bottom of the page was a reference code. Noah did not recognize it. But when he brought the manifest to Evelyn, she went pale. The code matched one of the references Arthur Bennett had written beneath his letter. It was not a random number. It was an old city archive designation used for sensitive materials moved without public cataloging. The true founder's register had not been destroyed. It was being transported, and Conrad Vale was planning to bring it into the library on the night of the gala. At first, Evelyn wanted Noah to stay away. She had already seen what Conrad's people were willing to do. They had planted the atlas. They had turned the library staff against him. They had made him look suspicious before he had done anything wrong. But Noah had spent too much of his life being told to sit quietly while adults made choices that changed everything around him. He did not want to be reckless. He did not want revenge. He only wanted to stop someone from erasing the truth, the way Arthur Bennett's truth had been erased. Evelyn understood that feeling better than anyone, so they made a plan. Evelyn would attend the gala even though she had not been invited. She would remain near the public entrance, where the press and city officials would be gathered. Noah would not confront Conrad. He would only look for the delivery crate and confirm whether the original register was inside. If he found it, he would not touch it. He would send Evelyn a message. The plan sounded simple, but nothing involving Conrad Vale had ever been simple. On the night of the gala, the Halston Heritage Library no longer looked like itself. The children's tables had been removed. The public computers were covered in black cloth. White flowers stood in silver vases beneath the marble staircase. A long carpet stretched through the main reading room, where students usually sat with notebooks and tired parents usually searched for work online. The library had become a ballroom. Guests in tuxedos and gowns arrived beneath strings of warm lights. City officials posed for photographs. Donors drank champagne beneath the stained glass ceiling. A small orchestra played near the old reference desk. At the center of the room, beneath a narrow beam of light, the fake Founders Register rested inside a glass display case. Conrad Vale stood nearby in a black dinner jacket, wearing a silver pin shaped like an open book. He smiled for cameras. He greeted politicians by name. He spoke about education, opportunity, and the future of Halston, with the ease of a man who had spent his life learning how to make people believe that wealth and goodness were the same thing. The guests loved him. They saw the billionaire who had promised $40 million. They saw the philanthropist who wanted to save an old library. They saw the man who had built towers, schools, foundations, and a reputation so polished that few people remembered what might be hidden beneath it. They did not see the forged amendment. They did not see the stolen register. They did not see the evidence Arthur Bennett had hidden 20 years earlier. Noah entered through the service corridor shortly before the main speech began. He wore a borrowed navy suit that was slightly too large at the shoulders. The sleeves were long. The shoes hurt his feet. His tie was not perfectly straight. He looked like a boy trying to belong in a room built for people who had never been told that they did not. Near the loading area, behind temporary catering stations and stacks of wine boxes, Noah found the crate marked for private archival handling. The Vale Community Futures logo was stamped across the side. His heart began to race. The crate had been placed behind a curtain beside flower supplies and event equipment. It was not locked. That seemed wrong to Noah. Something so important should have been guarded. But perhaps Conrad had believed no one would ever look there. Noah carefully lifted the lid. Inside, beneath layers of foam and packing paper, was the original Founders Register. He recognized it instantly. The leather cover bore the dark water stain near the lower corner. The binding looked older, heavier, and more fragile than the polished imitation displayed beneath the ballroom lights. For a moment, Noah could only stare. He thought of Arthur Bennett. He thought of Evelyn. He thought of the atlas planted beneath his table. He thought of every time someone had looked at his foster care file before they looked at his face. Then he made the decision that would change everything. He lifted the register from the crate. He intended to carry it only far enough to show Evelyn. He never made it out of the corridor. 2 security guards appeared before he reached the service door. They moved too quickly. They did not ask why he had the register. They did not ask how he found it. They did not seem surprised at all. They took the book from his hands and led him toward the ballroom. At that exact moment, the orchestra began to fade, and beneath the stained glass ceiling, surrounded by donors, politicians, and cameras, Conrad Vale was preparing to tell the city what kind of future he believed it deserved. When the security guards escorted Noah Bennett into the ballroom, the orchestra had just fallen silent. The sound disappeared so suddenly that the room seemed to hold its breath. Hundreds of guests turned toward the boy in the borrowed Navy suit. Under the stained glass ceiling of the Halston Heritage Library, Noah looked smaller than he had only minutes earlier. His hands were empty now. The old Founder's Register had been taken from him and held by one of the guards as though it were proof of a crime. Conrad Vale stood near the center of the room, surrounded by donors, city officials, cameras, and people who had spent the evening praising his generosity. He did not rush forward. He did not raise his voice. He understood that real power rarely needed to shout. Instead, he looked at Noah with carefully measured disappointment. To the guests, it seemed obvious what had happened. A foster boy had been found in a private service corridor, carrying the most valuable historical document in the library. The evidence looked simple. The story felt complete. And because Noah was young, poor, unknown, and already viewed with suspicion by people who had never bothered to know him, most of the room had decided he was guilty before anyone asked a single question. No one asked why a frightened 15-year-old would steal a book he could not sell. No one asked why security found him so quickly. No one asked why the original register had been stored inside a crate belonging to Conrad Vale's own foundation. They only saw what Conrad wanted them to see. The billionaire spoke to the room with a sadness that sounded almost compassionate. He described Noah as a young person who had been given an opportunity by the library, by the community, and by the very people gathered there that evening. He made it seem as though Noah had betrayed kindness. He made the guests feel sorrow for him, while quietly convincing them that he could not be trusted. It was a performance Conrad had perfected over decades. He knew how to make cruelty look like concern. Noah stood still beneath the stained glass ceiling, his face pale and his shoulders tense. He had spent years learning that when adults had already made up their minds, speaking too much could make things worse. So he said nothing. He only looked toward the rear entrance of the ballroom. That was when Evelyn Hart stepped into the room. She was not dressed like the other guests. She wore a simple dark coat over a plain dress. Her gray-brown hair was pinned neatly behind her head, and beneath one arm she carried the leather portfolio containing every piece of evidence she had managed to collect before Conrad's people pushed her out of the library. For a moment, no one noticed her. Then Conrad Vale did. His expression changed only slightly. It was small enough that most people missed it. But Evelyn saw the shift in his eyes. For the first time that night, the man who had controlled every detail of the gala looked uncertain. Evelyn walked past the donors, the board members, the city officials, and the photographers. She moved without hurry, but she did not hesitate. She had spent 20 years avoiding rooms like this one. 20 years allowing people to remember her as the woman who had supposedly betrayed the city. 20 years carrying the knowledge that the truth had been buried because no one important wanted to hear it. But this was no longer only about her. It was about Noah. It was about Arthur Bennett. It was about a library that had been built for people who had nowhere else to go. Evelyn stopped beside Noah and looked directly at the Founder's Register in the guard's hands. Then she looked toward the glass display case in the center of the ballroom. Inside the case, beneath a narrow beam of warm light, rested another version of the Founder's Register. The guests did not understand what they were seeing. Two old leather books could look nearly identical from a distance, but Evelyn did not need to touch them to know which one was real. The register beneath the glass was the forgery. The book Noah had found was the original. Evelyn told the room that Noah had not stolen anything. The real Founder's Register had been removed from the library vault and replaced with a false copy. Noah had found the original book hidden inside a crate, marked for private archival handling, a crate delivered by Vale Community Futures. A ripple moved through the crowd. Conrad responded calmly. He suggested that Evelyn was making another accusation without proof. He reminded the guests, in careful and indirect language, that she had once been involved in a financial scandal with the city. He wanted the room to remember her as a disgraced former auditor, not as the woman standing before them with evidence. It was the same weapon he had used 20 years earlier. But Evelyn had not come unprepared. She opened her portfolio and placed several photographs on a nearby table. The first showed the original register's old water stain, the dark mark near the lower corner of the leather cover caused by the Halston flood of 1947. The second showed the book currently displayed beneath the glass, smooth and spotless in the exact place where the stain should have been. The third showed the forged 1978 amendment that had supposedly allowed the library land to be leased to Vale Horizons. Then Evelyn began explaining the details. The register in the display case had been made with modern leather. Its gold edges had been chemically aged. Its thread stitching was too regular, too clean, and too new. The paper inside carried a watermark from a mill that did not exist in 1912. The pages had been machine-trimmed, while the original book's pages were uneven because they had been cut by hand. To many people in the room, those differences seemed small, but small details were often where lies failed. Evelyn pointed toward the register Noah had found. The true book carried the old flood stain. Its leather had darkened naturally over more than a century. Its binding was heavier. Its paper showed the irregular fibers of handmade archival stock. Every mark on it told the story of time. The forgery only told the story of someone trying to erase that time. A woman near the front stepped forward. Her name was Dr. Maya Collins, a historical preservation professor from Halston University. Conrad had invited her to the gala because he expected her to praise the renovation project and speak about the importance of preserving the library's heritage. Instead, she examined Evelyn's photographs, then looked carefully at the book beneath the glass, and finally turned toward the register held by security. Her expression tightened. She confirmed that Evelyn was correct. The book in the display case was not the original Founder's Register. It was a reproduction. The ballroom changed in an instant. Until that moment, Conrad Vale had controlled the story. He had been the benefactor. Noah had been the thief. Evelyn had been the bitter former employee trying to ruin a charitable evening. But now, with one expert confirmation, the entire room had to consider another possibility. What if the boy had been telling the truth? What if the woman they had dismissed was right? What if the man they had spent years admiring was hiding something far worse than a forged book? Conrad tried to regain control. He suggested that the reproduction might have been created for preservation purposes. He implied that his foundation had simply handled the materials incorrectly. He said the original register may have been moved without his knowledge. But Evelyn placed the delivery manifest beside the photographs. It showed the private archival crate scheduled through Vale Community Futures. The reference number matched one of Arthur Bennett's old archival codes. Then Evelyn revealed the photograph Noah had found online, taken earlier that evening by a catering employee. In the background, clearly visible behind the flower arrangements, was the crate being moved into the loading area by a Vale Community Futures staff member. The register had not been misplaced. It had been hidden. And it had been hidden by people connected directly to Conrad Vale. Noah finally spoke. His voice was quiet, but it carried through the room because no one else moved. He explained that he had found the real register inside the crate. He said he had recognized the water stain because Evelyn had described it to him. He did not claim to understand every detail. He did not try to sound brave. He simply told the truth. And because he did not ask for sympathy, the truth sounded stronger. For the first time that night, the guests looked at Noah differently. They no longer saw a foster boy caught with stolen property. They saw a child who had been placed at the center of a lie. Evelyn asked the guard to place the real founder's register on the table. Dr. Collins put on archival gloves. Evelyn did the same. Together, they opened the heavy leather cover. The first pages contained the names of the original trustees, the handwritten donations that funded the building, and the founding records of the library. The ink had faded from black to brown, but it was still readable. The pages were delicate, but they carried the weight of a century. Then Evelyn turned to the section that mattered most. There, in Margaret Halston's original handwriting, was the condition that Conrad Vale had tried to erase. The land beneath the library had been donated for permanent public use. It could not be sold, leased, transferred, or converted into private commercial property. If the city ever attempted to use the land for private development, ownership would automatically revert to the Halston Community Trust. The Vale Center for Tomorrow had been built on an illegal promise. The 99-year lease Conrad planned to use was invalid. His $40 million donation had never been a rescue plan. It had been the first step in taking control of land that did not belong to him. The room became quieter than before. Somewhere near the back, a glass touched the floor and shattered. But the biggest revelation had not yet arrived. Evelyn had spent days studying Arthur Bennett's letter. She had understood that his codes were more than references to missing files. They were instructions. Arthur had hidden something inside the one object Conrad would never dare destroy openly. Near the back cover of the Founder's Register, beneath a narrow strip of worn leather, Evelyn found an old stitched seam. It had been repaired after the flood decades earlier. To anyone else, it looked like ordinary restoration work. But Arthur had known the library well. He had known that old repairs were often ignored because people assumed they had no importance. He had trusted that one day, someone would understand the clue he had left behind. Evelyn carefully loosened the seam. Inside the spine of the register was a folded packet wrapped in wax paper. The packet had been hidden there for 20 years. Evelyn opened it slowly. Inside were 3 things. The first was a notarized statement written by Arthur Bennett. In it, he described how he and Evelyn had uncovered altered land records, falsified redevelopment contracts, and diverted public funds linked to Conrad Vale's earliest business operations. The second was a duplicate ledger containing transaction codes that matched the irregularities Evelyn had discovered before the city accused her of fraud. The third was a list of account numbers, shell companies, transfer dates, and financial references connecting Vale Community Futures to the same network of accounts that had existed 20 years earlier under different names. The past had not disappeared. Arthur had preserved it. He had hidden it inside the very book Conrad had tried to replace with a beautiful lie. Conrad reached toward the table. It was only a small movement, but everyone saw it. Until that moment, he had remained composed. Men like Conrad Vale did not collapse the way ordinary people imagined. They had spent too many years practicing dignity in public. But when he saw Arthur's statement in Evelyn's hands, the color left his face. He knew exactly what the documents meant. The forged amendment connected to the false register. The false register connected to the illegal lease. The lease connected to Veil Horizons. The ledger connected to the redevelopment fraud from 20 years earlier. And the old case against Evelyn Hart was no longer a forgotten scandal. It was evidence. The ballroom did not erupt at once. At first, people simply stared. The mayor stepped away from Conrad. The library board chair lowered her glass. Reporters began moving closer, their phones raised, their cameras recording. Dr. Collins continued examining the documents. Her silence carried more weight than any dramatic announcement. Then someone from the city attorney's office stepped forward and requested that the Founders Register, Arthur's statement, the ledger, and all related transfer documents be secured immediately. The gala was suspended. The auction never began. Conrad tried to speak privately with the board members, but privacy had disappeared from the room. The donors who had praised him all evening were suddenly eager to distance themselves. The officials who supported the lease began insisting that they had trusted the legal review process. The people who had benefited from Conrad's power discovered that they had never really known him. That was not entirely true. Some of them had known enough. They had simply decided that knowing was less important than staying close to him. Noah was released from security custody before the police even arrived. The guards apologized in the stiff, uncomfortable way people apologized when they realized they had treated a child like a criminal because it was easier than questioning a wealthy man. Noah did not say much. His hands were still shaking. Evelyn stood beside him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, Noah looked at the old photograph Evelyn had brought in her portfolio. Arthur Bennett stood beside the younger version of Evelyn, both of them surrounded by file boxes and records that no one had wanted to believe. For the first time, Noah understood that his grandfather had not died as a forgotten man. Arthur had spent his final years protecting the truth for people he would never live long enough to meet. And Evelyn understood something too. Arthur had trusted the future more than he had trusted the present. He had hidden the evidence because he believed that someday, someone would be brave enough to find it. The first headlines appeared before midnight. By morning, Halston was no longer talking about Conrad Vale's donation. It was talking about forged documents, hidden ledgers, a stolen historical register, and a foster boy who had been accused of theft while holding the evidence that could expose one of the city's most powerful men. The investigation did not end in a single night. Real justice rarely does. For weeks, state auditors examined records connected to Veil Horizons, Veil Community Futures, and several companies that had been created and dissolved over the past 2 decades. Investigators reopened the case against Evelyn Hart. Former city employees were interviewed. Some had been too afraid to speak years earlier. Some had seen files disappear. Some had been pressured to revise dates, remove pages, or approve financial transfers they did not understand. One former accountant described being told that certain payments should never be questioned because Conrad Vale had influential friends. Another employee from Veil Community Futures provided internal emails showing that the original Founders Register had been moved without library authorization. A retired clerk confirmed that Arthur Bennett had warned the city about altered deeds long before he was dismissed. The deeper investigators looked, the more they found. Conrad Vale had not built his entire empire through fraud. That was what made the truth even more disturbing. His businesses had been large enough, successful enough, and respectable enough on the surface to hide the parts that were not. He had used real projects, real donations, and real public goodwill as cover for a pattern of manipulation that had begun long before most people at the gala knew his name. The library lease was canceled. the city was forced to acknowledge that the land could not be transferred for private benefit. The Halston Community Trust took legal control of the property under Margaret Halston's original founding condition. The old building would remain public. Conrad's commercial development plan was abandoned. His foundation board removed him from leadership. Major donors withdrew support. Politicians who had once praised him began claiming they had been deceived. His company lost contracts. His reputation, built carefully over decades, began to collapse under the weight of documents he had assumed no one would ever find. Months later, Conrad Vale was charged with document forgery, financial fraud, obstruction of a public investigation, conspiracy to manipulate municipal records, and the false accusation of a minor. He was not destroyed because someone shouted louder than he did. He was destroyed because the records he had ignored finally spoke louder than his reputation. That was the poetic justice of it. Conrad had spent his life believing that buildings were valuable only when they could be turned into profit. He had looked at the library and seen land waiting to be claimed. He had looked at old documents and seen clutter. He had looked at Evelyn Hart and seen a woman whose name could be buried. He had looked at Noah Bennett and seen a boy nobody would defend. But in the end, the old library became the place where his lies were exposed. The papers he considered useless became the evidence that ended his control. The woman he thought he had ruined became the person who restored the truth. And the boy he called a thief became the reason the truth survived long enough to be found. Evelyn's exoneration came quietly. There was no parade, no grand television special, no famous speaker standing beneath the stained glass ceiling. Instead, the city attorney's office released a formal statement confirming that the case against her had been built on manipulated evidence and incomplete records. Her name was cleared. Her professional license was restored. The city issued an apology that was far too brief for 20 years of damage. But it was more than Evelyn had once believed she would ever receive. Martin Gage visited her several weeks later. He looked older than he had before the gala. He admitted that he had failed her. He had wanted to protect the library, but in doing so, he had protected the people trying to take it away. He had confused caution with integrity. Evelyn did not forgive him easily. She did not need to. Forgiveness was not pretending that nothing had happened. She made him understand that institutions were not saved by avoiding conflict. They were saved by refusing to abandon the people who tried to protect them. Martin stepped down as library director at the end of the year. The Halston Community Trust asked Evelyn to return as director of public archives and historical preservation. At first, she hesitated. The title felt too large. The office felt too close to the life she had once lost. But Noah reminded her that the library had never needed someone who looked important. It needed someone who understood what was worth protecting. So Evelyn accepted. The first project she approved was the restoration of the lower archive wing. The second was the creation of the Arthur Bennett Reading Room. It was not a grand hall with marble plaques and expensive furniture. It was a warm, bright room on the first floor where children could read, study, use computers, ask for help with schoolwork, and learn how to search public records. A framed photograph of Arthur Bennett hung near the entrance beside a small brass plaque describing him as a city records clerk who had protected the truth when few others would. Noah attended the opening ceremony in a suit that actually fit. He did not become a millionaire. He did not suddenly inherit a mansion or receive some impossible reward that solved every problem in his life. His foster care situation did not magically become easy. There were still forms, meetings, uncertainty, and memories that could not disappear because one wealthy man had finally been exposed. But Noah was no longer alone. The library hired him as a paid youth archive assistant. He learned how to preserve paper, repair damaged bindings, search municipal databases, and trace the history of buildings that other people passed without noticing. He began taking evening classes through a local college program. For the first time, he had adults who did not see him as a file number or a problem waiting to happen. He had a place where his curiosity was not treated like trouble. He had a future that did not depend on someone else deciding whether he deserved one. Nearly a year after the gala, Noah returned to the lower archive room where Arthur's letter had been found. Evelyn was there, sorting a box of newly cataloged documents. The old brass key rested in Noah's palm. For a long time, he looked at it without speaking. Then he placed it inside a small display case beside Arthur's photograph. The key had once represented a locked past. It had been the only thing Noah carried from a grandfather he barely remembered. But now it meant something different. It was no longer a reminder of what had been hidden. It was proof that some doors stayed closed only until the right person found the courage to open them. The Halston Heritage Library remained standing. The roof was repaired, but not with Conrad's money. Community groups raised funds. Former students returned to donate. Local businesses contributed without demanding that their names be carved into stone. The city restored public support after learning, through humiliation, that libraries were not private charities for the wealthy to rescue. They were public promises. And every day, people continued coming through the library's doors. Children came to read. Parents came to fill out job applications. Older patrons came to sit by the windows. Teenagers came to study or hide from the rain. Most of them never knew every detail of the scandal that had saved the building. They did not need to. The lights were on. The shelves were full. The doors remained open to anyone. That was enough. But Evelyn never forgot the lesson hidden inside Arthur Bennett's letter. Truth does not disappear because it is weak. Sometimes it disappears because powerful people train everyone else to look away. They make doubt feel embarrassing. They make questions feel dangerous. They make ordinary people believe that wealth, confidence, and public applause are the same thing as goodness. But they are not. And in the end, it took a quiet archivist, a foster boy everyone was ready to blame, and a book full of forgotten pages to remind an entire city that dignity does not belong only to those who can afford to defend themselves. Sometimes the people treated as invisible are the only ones still paying attention. Sometimes the things everyone calls old are the only witnesses that never lie. And sometimes justice begins the moment one person decides that silence has lasted long enough. If you believe that truth deserves to be protected, even when powerful people try to bury it, share this story and tell us what you would have done if you had been in that room.
Step away from that Ferrari before I make this worse for you.
Malcolm Reed did not move an inch.
You already made it worse when you decided I could not own it.
His appearance told Vanessa everything she assumed.
A man like you does not arrive here in a car like that.
But Malcolm gave her one quiet warning.
Be very careful with the story you are about to tell.
Vanessa turned suspicion into a public accusation.
Someone call security! This man is trying to steal from my company!
The valet knew the truth was nearby.
Ma'am, I think you should look at the registration first.
Vanessa made sure he could not speak.
One more word, and you will lose this job tonight.
Malcolm protected him without raising his voice.
Do not punish him for telling the truth.
The truth is obvious. He does not belong beside a Ferrari.
The crowd watched Vanessa judge him openly. Still, Malcolm never looked afraid. Then police lights washed over the Ferrari.
Sir, keep your hands where I can see them. Before you touch me, you may want to call your superiors.
But Malcolm's silence had a history. To understand why Malcolm Reed stood there so still while a woman tried to turn his life into a crime scene, you have to understand that he had survived far worse than being underestimated. He had built his entire life in rooms where people looked at him last, listened to him least, and then acted surprised when his ideas saved them. Malcolm had been born in a neighborhood where broken engines were more common than working streetlights, and where boys learned early that the world often noticed their mistakes faster than their talent. His father had driven buses for nearly 30 years. His mother cleaned offices and buildings where the executives never learned her name. But in their small garage behind the house, Malcolm found a language that did not care about status. Engines either worked or they did not. Metal either fit or it failed. A machine could be understood if a person had patience, discipline, and the humility to listen. As a child, Malcolm could not afford model cars, so he drew them. He sketched the curves of Italian sports cars from old magazines other people threw away. He studied the way light moved across the hood of a Ferrari, the way every line seemed to be a decision made by someone who understood speed as both science and poetry. But he did not love cars because they were expensive. He loved them because they were proof that imagination could become something real enough to touch. While other boys dreamed of owning a Ferrari, Malcolm dreamed of understanding why one existed at all. He wanted to know how beauty and engineering could meet in one object so perfectly that even a stranger on the sidewalk would stop breathing for half a second. That obsession carried him out of the neighborhood, through scholarships, late-night jobs, and years of being the only person in the room who looked like him. He became an engineer first, then a designer, then a businessman almost by accident. People who understood cars trusted him. People who understood numbers eventually had no choice but to respect him. But Malcolm never chased attention. Attention to him was a noisy room where people applauded before they understood the cost of what they were praising. He preferred quiet ownership. He preferred to build things and let others stand beneath the lights. It was a habit born partly from humility and partly from pain. The person who understood that pain best was his wife, Eleanor Reed. Eleanor had met Malcolm before anyone called him brilliant, before investors returned his calls, before his first company appeared in financial magazines. She had met him when he still carried engine grease under his fingernails and apology in his posture, as though the world had taught him to take up less space than he deserved. Eleanor never saw him that way. She saw the mind behind the quiet. She saw the patience behind the restraint. She saw a man who could walk past a showroom window and describe, from memory, how the car inside breathed. For years, Malcolm and Eleanor built a life that looked ordinary from the outside and extraordinary from within. She taught high school literature. He worked impossible hours in the automotive industry, first repairing what others broke, then designing systems that made luxury dealerships more efficient, more honest, and more profitable. He believed the car business did not have to be built on arrogance. He believed that people buying a dream should not be cheated by those selling it. Eleanor believed in him so completely that when he hesitated to start his own company, she placed a notebook on the kitchen table and filled the first page with the name she thought belonged to his future. Reed Caldwell Automotive Group. Caldwell was not Malcolm's name. It belonged to Richard Caldwell, a charming investor with old money, perfect teeth, and the kind of confidence that opened doors before he knocked. Richard had the connections Malcolm lacked. Malcolm had the vision Richard could never have invented. Together, they launched what would eventually become Caldwell Prestige Motors, a chain of high-end dealerships known for rare European cars, white glove service, and a reputation so polished that wealthy customers trusted it before reading the contracts. In the early days, Malcolm believed partnership meant shared purpose. He learned later that some people use partnership as a polite word for taking what another person built. Richard Caldwell liked Malcolm's mind, but he did not like Malcolm's presence at the front of the company. Investors, Richard warned, were more comfortable with a familiar face. Clients, he suggested, expected a certain image. Malcolm heard the meaning beneath every careful phrase. He had heard it his whole life. So he stayed behind the curtain and built the systems, trained the staff, negotiated the supplier relationships, and designed the customer ethics policy that became the company's hidden strength. Richard smiled at ribbon cuttings. Malcolm made sure the lights stayed on. Then came the betrayal. It was not dramatic at first. Betrayal rarely announces itself with thunder. It arrives as missing paperwork, delayed signatures, board meetings rescheduled without notice, legal language no one explains until it is too late. By the time Malcolm realized Richard had tried to push him out, the company was already wearing another man's name like a stolen suit. Eleanor wanted him to fight publicly. She wanted the world to know who had built the foundation beneath Caldwell's marble floors. Malcolm wanted justice too, but he also knew the cost of a public battle. He had seen what powerful men could do when they felt exposed. He chose a slower kind of justice, one that required patience, discipline, and the kind of silence most people mistake for surrender. With Eleanor's help, Malcolm protected what mattered. Through a private family trust, carefully structured before Richard understood what was happening, Malcolm retained controlling interest in the holding company behind Caldwell Prestige Motors. Richard kept the spotlight. Malcolm kept the keys. The arrangement was strange, but it worked. Malcolm stepped away from the public face of the company and built a private investment firm that quietly rescued businesses, funded scholarships, and supported young mechanics who reminded him of the boy he used to be. Richard Caldwell enjoyed fame until illness and debt consumed the last years of his life. After his death, the Caldwell name remained, but the real power never sat where outsiders thought it did. Eleanor was the only person who knew how much that silence had cost him. She knew that every time Malcolm entered one of his own dealerships and watched employees fail to recognize him, a small part of him had to choose peace over pride. She also knew he was not weak. He was waiting. Not waiting for revenge exactly, but for the right moment to turn ownership into protection. She used to tell him that wealth was only meaningful when it defended people who had none. Malcolm carried those words long after Eleanor became ill, long after hospital rooms replaced business meetings, long after the woman who had believed in him before the world did left him with more money than he wanted, and one promise he could not forget. The Ferrari came from that promise. Years before Eleanor died, she and Malcolm had walked past a private collection after a charity dinner. Inside, under warm museum lights, was a deep red Ferrari, 812 super fast, elegant and aggressive, a machine that seemed to be moving even while parked. Eleanor had smiled at the way Malcolm stopped talking mid-sentence. She had known he was not seeing status. He was seeing childhood, survival, and design brought together in one impossible shape. She had told him that one day, when he finally stopped hiding from the life he had earned, he should buy one in red, not because rich men did, but because the boy in the garage deserved to see his dream in color. Malcolm did not buy it while she was alive. During her illness, extravagance felt obscene. After her funeral, it felt empty. But on the first anniversary of her passing, he purchased the Ferrari through the Eleanor Reed Memorial Trust, not as a trophy, but as a memorial. He had her initials engraved inside the cabin, where only someone looking closely would notice. He drove it rarely, and only on days connected to purpose. The car was not a toy. It was a reminder that grief could travel with beauty, and that promises made in love did not expire when a heartbeat stopped. The night of the Meridian Auto Museum Gala was one of those days. Caldwell Prestige Motors was sponsoring the event, at least publicly, but the real money came from the Eleanor Reed Memorial Trust. The gala was meant to launch a scholarship program for underprivileged students entering automotive engineering and technical training. Malcolm had insisted the program focus not on polished applicants with perfect resumes, but on young people who had learned from broken engines, family sacrifice, and necessity. He wanted the scholarship to find the version of himself the world had nearly missed. Vanessa Caldwell had other priorities. She was not Richard Caldwell's daughter, though she allowed people to assume the connection when it helped her. She had married briefly into the extended Caldwell family, kept the name after the divorce, and built a career out of appearing indispensable to men who confused Polish with competence. Vanessa had been appointed interim CEO after a leadership scandal shook the company, and she treated the temporary position as though it were a throne. She understood luxury branding, media optics, and the social choreography of wealthy rooms. She did not understand loyalty. She did not understand craftsmanship. And she certainly did not understand the kind of quiet power that did not need to introduce itself. To Vanessa, Caldwell Prestige Motors was an image to be sold. She wanted to merge the company with a foreign luxury conglomerate that had no interest in Malcolm's ethics policies, scholarship commitments, or employee protections. The sale would have given Vanessa an enormous personal bonus and a permanent title in the new organization. It also would have gutted the foundation Malcolm had built. Customer service departments would be outsourced. Longtime mechanics would be dismissed. The scholarship fund would be renamed, reduced, and folded into a marketing campaign. Vanessa called it modernization. Malcolm saw it for what it was: extraction disguised as progress. For months, Malcolm had watched from a distance as reports crossed his desk. Customer complaints rose. Employees resigned. Warranty claims were delayed to improve quarterly numbers. A small transfer from the charity budget had been labeled as event preparation, then moved again through consulting fees. No single entry proved corruption by itself, but together they created a pattern. Malcolm had seen enough patterns in his life to know when a machine was beginning to fail. He did not rush. He asked his legal team to gather documents. He asked the board chair to observe quietly. And then he accepted the invitation to attend the Meridian Gala in person. He did not tell Vanessa he was coming. He did not ask for a reserved entrance. He did not request a security escort or a press announcement. He drove himself in the Ferrari because Eleanor would have laughed at the idea of him arriving in a chauffeured sedan to a scholarship created in her name. He wore a simple navy jacket, a white shirt, and the watch Eleanor had given him when their first company turned a profit. The watch was not flashy. Its value was sentimental, not obvious. That was how Malcolm preferred most things. At the museum, the evening was already glittering when he arrived. The building curved in glass and steel around a central hall filled with historic race cars, polished engines, and photographs of drivers who had risked everything for speed. Wealth moved through the room with practiced ease. Champagne glasses caught the light. Sponsors smiled for cameras. Young scholarship applicants stood near the edges, dressed in borrowed suits and careful dresses, trying not to look overwhelmed by a world that had rarely opened doors for them. Malcolm noticed them first. He always noticed the people standing at the edges. One of those young people was Jordan Ellis, a valet assigned to the front entrance for the evening. Jordan was 22, nervous, and trying hard to appear invisible. 3 years earlier, he had been one bad month away from dropping out of a technical training program when an anonymous grant paid his tuition balance. He never learned the donor's name, only that the grant came from a trust connected to automotive education. What Jordan did not know yet was that the man stepping out of the red Ferrari was the reason he had a uniform, a job, and a future still within reach. Jordan recognized the car before he recognized the man. Everyone did. The Ferrari seemed to gather attention as naturally as fire gathers heat. Malcolm handed over no performance, no boast, no demand for special treatment. He simply greeted Jordan with respect, asked whether the staff had been given a place to eat during the long event, and waited for the answer with the seriousness of someone who considered that question important. Jordan was so startled by the courtesy that it took him a moment to respond. Most guests treated valet workers as extensions of the curb. Malcolm treated him as a person whose comfort mattered. That small exchange might have passed unnoticed if Vanessa Caldwell had not been standing near the entrance, preparing for a photographer. She saw the Ferrari first, then Malcolm, then Jordan's uncertain expression. In the space of a few seconds, her mind arranged those details into the only story her prejudice could accept. The car was too rare. The man was too understated. The valet looked too nervous. And the gala was too important for her to risk embarrassment. Vanessa did not approach like a host welcoming a donor. She approached like a property owner finding a stranger near the silverware. Malcolm saw the change in her face before she spoke. He had seen it in boutiques, hotels, boardrooms, country clubs, and once in the lobby of a bank that held more of his money than the manager earned in a decade. It was the look of someone deciding that evidence was unnecessary because assumption felt more natural. Vanessa asked for proof before she asked for his name. She looked at his jacket, then at the Ferrari, then at the gathering crowd, as though she were protecting civilization from a clerical error. Malcolm could have ended the moment there. He could have given his full name, called the board chair, or let one of the wealthiest families in the city learn within seconds who he was. But he had not come to the gala to perform power. He had come to watch what Caldwell had become when it believed he was absent. So he did what he had done for most of his life. He stayed calm, offered the simplest truth, and watched carefully to see who would choose fairness when fairness was inconvenient. Vanessa failed that test almost immediately. Vanessa Caldwell had spent her career learning how to turn uncertainty into authority. She knew that in wealthy spaces, the person who sounded most offended often controlled the room. So when Malcolm Reed calmly explained that the Ferrari belonged to him, she treated his calmness not as evidence of innocence, but as arrogance. She insisted that the vehicle matched one recently serviced by Caldwell Prestige Motors, and because her company had sponsored the gala, she claimed a responsibility to protect its assets, its reputation, and its guests. The words sounded professional enough from a distance. Up close, They were something uglier, wearing a tailored suit. Malcolm listened without interruption. That made people uneasy. A guilty man, they expected, would panic. An innocent man, they assumed, would defend himself loudly. Malcolm did neither. He stood beside the Ferrari with the stillness of someone who had learned long ago that raising his voice would only make certain people feel justified in fearing him. He removed the registration card from a leather folder and offered it to Vanessa. She glanced at it only long enough to dismiss it. The name on the paperwork did not satisfy her, because it did not match the story she had already chosen. Eleanor Reed Memorial Trust meant nothing to her except another obstacle between her accusation and the public victory she wanted. The crowd grew thicker. Guests who had come to celebrate charity now lingered for scandal. A few recorded openly. Others pretended to check messages while angling their phones toward Malcolm's face. This was how humiliation multiplied in the modern world. It no longer needed a courtroom or a newspaper. It needed only a confident liar, a silent crowd, and a camera hungry enough to turn a human being into content before the truth had time to breathe. Jordan Ellis stood near the valet podium with his hands tight at his sides. He knew something was wrong. The man beside the Ferrari did not move like a thief. He had arrived openly, not in a rush. He had spoken kindly. He had known to ask about the staff meal, a detail no ordinary guest noticed. Most importantly, Jordan had seen the registration card. He had caught the name of the trust, and something about it stirred a memory from the tuition letter he had kept folded in a shoebox at home. The grant that saved his future had come from the Eleanor Reed Memorial Trust. The same words were on the card Vanessa had just refused to believe. Jordan wanted to speak, but fear trapped him. His supervisor had warned the valet staff before the event that Vanessa Caldwell did not tolerate embarrassment. Workers who caused trouble would not be invited back. For Jordan, losing this job meant more than missing a paycheck. It meant falling behind on rent, delaying certification, maybe returning to the same dead-end work he had fought to escape. He watched Vanessa sharpen her accusation, and shame burned in him because he understood how silence could become cooperation. Inside the museum, the gala continued without understanding that its true purpose was being threatened outside the doors. Young students stood near displays of vintage engines, while donors congratulated themselves for generosity. A large banner promised a new future for overlooked talent in automotive engineering. Malcolm had funded that banner. He had funded the scholarships, the mentorship program, and the equipment grants that would follow. Yet outside, the man whose money made the evening possible was being treated as the danger. Vanessa's suspicion quickly became performance. She reminded everyone within earshot that Caldwell Prestige Motors dealt in vehicles worth more than most homes and could not afford to ignore irregularities. She emphasized that the Ferrari was a rare model, that criminals often targeted events like this, and that responsible leadership required swift action. Every sentence made her sound less like a woman seeking truth and more like someone auditioning for applause. The fact that Malcolm remained composed only irritated her further. She needed him to look guilty. She needed fear in his eyes. She needed the crowd to see what she believed she saw. When museum security arrived, Vanessa did not present uncertainty. She presented conclusion. She described Malcolm as an unauthorized individual attempting to take control of a high-value vehicle connected to her company. The words were careful, polished, and poisonous. They avoided the crudeness of open prejudice while carrying the same conclusion. This man didn't belong here, and therefore his ownership must be impossible. Malcolm again offered documentation. Again, Vanessa's certainty moved faster than anyone's willingness to verify. Security asked Malcolm to step away from the vehicle. He did. That small act of cooperation seemed to disappoint the people waiting for drama. He did not reach into his pocket suddenly. He did not challenge them with anger. He simply stepped back, folded his hands, and asked that the documents be checked before anyone treated an assumption as fact. One guard looked embarrassed. Another looked toward Vanessa, as though her title mattered more than the paperwork in Malcolm's hand. That glance told Malcolm almost everything he needed to know about the culture she had created. Vanessa noticed it too. Power teaches some people to recognize hesitation and punish it before it becomes courage. She pressed harder, reminding the guards that the entire gala was under media coverage and that any delay could become a reputational disaster. What she did not mention was that she had already created the disaster. In her mind, reputation meant controlling how things looked, not whether they were right. The first police car arrived 10 minutes later. To the crowd, it felt like confirmation. People who had been unsure now adjusted their faces into expressions of concern. Police lights have a way of turning suspicion into a script, and once that script begins, many people stop asking who wrote it. Malcolm watched the officers approach. He had known this possibility from the moment Vanessa raised her voice. He had also known that his wealth, his documents, and his education might not protect him quickly enough if the wrong person decided that his calmness was defiance. The lead officer, Daniel Price, was not cruel in the theatrical way Vanessa was cruel. His danger was quieter. He arrived with the fatigue of a man who believed he had seen enough to trust shortcuts. Vanessa gave him her version first. She did it quickly, confidently, and with just enough corporate language to sound credible. She described the Ferrari as possibly stolen from company custody, Malcolm as evasive, and the registration paperwork as suspicious. By the time Malcolm was invited to explain, he was no longer a man beside his own car. He was a suspect, attempting to overcome a story already planted. Malcolm handed over his identification and the registration card. Officer Price studied them, then studied Malcolm, then looked at Vanessa. That sequence mattered. The documents should have been the center of gravity. Instead, the officer's eyes kept returning to the woman in the expensive dress, who seemed so certain. Malcolm recognized the old imbalance. Paper was supposed to speak equally for everyone, but in the real world, paper often needed a powerful person to read it honestly. Vanessa grew bolder when she sensed the officer's uncertainty. She claimed there had been internal alerts about inventory irregularities at a Caldwell service facility. That part was not entirely false, which made the lie more dangerous. There had been irregularities, but they were not caused by Malcolm. They were caused by Vanessa's own pressure on employees to move vehicles and records in ways that made quarterly reports look cleaner than they were. One of those records involved a Ferrari recently serviced under a trust account. Vanessa had seen the paperwork days earlier and ignored the owner's name because she was focused on something else, hiding the fact that charity funds and service charges had been shifted between accounts before the merger review. The Ferrari, in other words, was not evidence of Malcolm's crime. It was evidence of Vanessa's panic. But no one outside the museum knew that yet. All they saw was a black man being questioned beside a car they assumed belonged to someone richer, louder, and more expected. Officer Price asked Malcolm why he had come to the event. Malcolm explained that he had been invited. Vanessa challenged that immediately, claiming she had personally reviewed the VIP list and did not recall seeing his name. She made memory sound like proof. Malcolm did not argue. He simply provided the digital invitation stored on his phone. Vanessa leaned in, saw the donor access credential, and for the first time a flicker of concern crossed her face. It disappeared quickly, but Malcolm saw it. The credential did not list him as Malcolm Reed. It listed him under the name of the trust. That was by his own design. For years, he had preferred the work to be recognized, not the man behind it. But now the privacy that had protected his peace gave Vanessa room to attack him. She suggested the invitation could have been obtained improperly. She suggested the trust name could be used as cover. She suggested anything that kept her from admitting the simplest possibility, that she had been wrong from the beginning. A younger officer asked whether someone from Caldwell's headquarters could verify the service records. Vanessa answered before Malcolm could. She insisted that she was the highest-ranking Caldwell executive present, and that her judgment should be sufficient until the vehicle could be impounded. The word impounded moved through the crowd like a spark. Phones lifted higher. Jordan's face tightened. Malcolm looked toward the Ferrari, not because he feared losing it, but because the thought of that car being dragged away under suspicion felt like an insult to Eleanor's memory. He remembered the day the Ferrari arrived. He had stood alone in the delivery room, while the dealer representative explained features Malcolm already understood better than he did. The car had gleamed beneath the lights, but Malcolm had not touched the steering wheel right away. He had placed his hand on the seat beside him, imagining Eleanor there, teasing him for pretending not to be emotional. He had whispered nothing aloud. He had only breathed through grief and gratitude until both became too large to separate. Now Vanessa was turning that memory into evidence of theft, and the cruelty of it settled deeper than her words. Still, Malcolm remained calm. Not because he felt nothing, but because he felt too much to waste it on spectacle. He asked Officer Price to contact the registration authority, the insurer, and the attorney listed on the trust documents. He also asked that the vehicle not be touched until its ownership was verified. The requests were reasonable. Vanessa treated them as manipulation. She accused him of trying to delay accountability and warned the officers that sophisticated thieves often used paperwork to confuse law enforcement. That phrase pleased her. It made prejudice sound like expertise. The situation might have turned then if Jordan had found his courage sooner. He stepped forward halfway, then stopped when Vanessa's assistant, a thin man named Miles Voss, moved beside him and quietly reminded him that temporary staff were replaceable. Miles did not need to raise his voice. Fear does not require volume when the power imbalance is clear. Jordan swallowed what he knew and stepped back. Malcolm saw the exchange. He did not blame the young man. He had once been young enough to know how expensive courage could be. Inside the museum, the gala program was nearing the scholarship announcement. Vanessa was supposed to appear on stage in 15 minutes. She knew that if Malcolm was still outside, if police were still questioning him, if guests kept filming, the evening would become impossible to control. So she made the choice that revealed her more clearly than anything she had said. She urged the officers to remove him from the entrance before donors became uncomfortable. Not before the truth was verified. Not before paperwork was checked. Before donors became uncomfortable. That was the moment Malcolm understood that Vanessa had to be removed from Caldwell, not merely corrected. A person who valued donor comfort over human dignity could not be trusted with a scholarship fund built for overlooked students. A leader who saw humiliation as a branding problem could not protect employees who lacked power. Malcolm had come to observe. Vanessa had given him the answer. Officer Price asked Malcolm to place his hands where they could be seen while they sorted things out. The request was framed as procedure, but procedure can feel very different depending on whose body carries the risk. The crowd grew silent in the way crowds do when they know something wrong is happening, but want permission from authority before admitting it. Malcolm complied. He could feel dozens of eyes on him. He could feel Eleanor's initials inside the car behind him. He could feel old memories rising. The bank lobby, the hotel elevator, the showroom where a salesman once assumed he was the driver for someone else. Each memory carried the same message. Prove you belong. Prove you are not a threat. Prove you own what you built. Then Jordan finally moved. He did not shout. He did not make a grand speech. He stepped toward Officer Price with his hands trembling and explained that he had seen the registration card, that the trust name matched the scholarship donor materials, and that Malcolm had arrived as an invited guest. His voice shook, but truth does not need to be fearless to matter. Vanessa turned on him instantly. She accused him of interfering in a police matter and warned that his employment would be reviewed. The threat landed exactly where she aimed it. Jordan went pale, but he did not step back this time. That small act changed the air. One of the younger scholarship applicants inside the museum noticed the commotion through the glass. Then another. Soon, several students moved toward the entrance, drawn not by gossip, but by the uneasy recognition that the man outside looked more like their fathers, uncles, neighbors, and future selves than anyone on the gala stage. They had come to be celebrated by a company claiming to believe in overlooked talent. Now they were watching that company's acting CEO overlook truth in real time. Malcolm looked at Jordan with gratitude, but not surprise. Courage often begins as a whisper. He knew that. He also knew Vanessa would punish the young man if she survived the night with power intact. So Malcolm made one final request, this time not to the officer, but to the process itself. He asked that his attorney be contacted immediately and that the board chair of Caldwell Prestige Motors be informed that the trust's representative was being detained at the entrance of the event, funded by that same trust. Vanessa laughed at the phrase "trust's representative," not loudly, but with enough contempt for those closest to hear. She thought Malcolm was dressing himself in legal language to escape consequence. She did not understand that he had just given her one last chance to pause before stepping over the edge. Officer Price, still unsure but increasingly aware that the situation was more complicated than Vanessa had claimed, allowed Malcolm to make a call. Malcolm did not call a friend to rescue him emotionally. He called Amina Pierce, the attorney who had protected his interests for 15 years and who had warned him that Vanessa Caldwell's ambition had finally become dangerous. He gave her only a few calm details: the museum entrance, the Ferrari, the attempted impound, the presence of police, and Vanessa's refusal to verify ownership. Amina did not need more. She had been waiting for the machine to expose its broken part. While they waited, Vanessa tried to reclaim control by moving the event forward. She instructed Miles to inform the stage manager that the scholarship announcement would be delayed due to a security issue. That phrase spread quickly through staff radios. Security issue. It sounded clean. It sounded neutral. It erased Malcolm's name, Vanessa's accusation, Jordan's courage, and the simple fact that the only danger present had been created by a woman who mistook her bias for leadership. Minutes passed. The crowd shifted. The police checked the license plate and found no stolen vehicle report. They checked Malcolm's identification and found no warrant, no record, no reason to restrain him. But Vanessa kept insisting that internal company records raised concern. She promised documentation from Caldwell's system, and Miles hurried to retrieve a tablet. When he returned, the record he showed listed the Ferrari as pending corporate hold. It looked official enough to confuse the officers. It was also false, altered that afternoon by someone using executive access. Malcolm saw the screen and understood. The accusation was no longer just prejudice. It was fraud being improvised in public. For the first time that evening, his expression changed. Not into anger, not exactly, but into something colder. Disappointment, sharpened by certainty. Vanessa mistook it for fear and pressed forward, urging the officers to detain him until the discrepancy could be resolved. Officer Price reached for his cuffs, not with eagerness, but with the weary surrender of a man letting a flawed process carry him. Jordan stepped forward again, but a security guard blocked him. Several guests began recording closer. Vanessa's eyes brightened with victory. And in that suspended moment, as Malcolm Reed stood beside the Ferrari that carried his wife's initials, with one officer preparing to turn assumption into restraint, the glass doors of the museum opened behind the crowd. A woman in a gray suit entered with a leather case in one hand and the expression of someone who had not come to negotiate. Behind her walked Bernard Hayes, the board chair Vanessa had been trying to avoid for months, and Marisol Chen, Caldwell's chief financial officer, carrying a folder thick enough to end careers. Vanessa saw them and went still. Malcolm did not smile. He simply lowered his hands and waited for the truth to arrive. Amina Pierce did not need to raise her voice to take control of the entrance. Some people carry authority like jewelry, bright and decorative, meant to be noticed before it is useful. Amina carried it like a blade kept sharp in silence. She moved through the crowd without asking anyone to step aside, and still they did. Bernard Hayes followed with the exhausted look of a man who had ignored too many warning signs and was now watching them gather into proof. Marisol Chen kept her eyes on Vanessa, not with hatred, but with the clean sadness of someone who had finally confirmed what she had feared. Vanessa recovered first, or tried to. She spoke to Bernard as though this were merely an unfortunate misunderstanding caused by an uncooperative guest. She framed the police presence as a necessary precaution. She described Malcolm as evasive, the Ferrari as suspicious, and the altered company record as justification for every humiliating second that had passed. But her words no longer landed with the same force. Power depends on the room believing you are the highest authority present. Vanessa had just lost that illusion. Amina asked Officer Price to review the documents in her case before any further action was taken. This time, no one dismissed the paperwork. The first document established the Ferrari's ownership. The vehicle had been purchased legally, insured properly, and registered through the Eleanor Reed Memorial Trust. The VIN matched, the title matched, the insurance matched, the trust documents matched. There was no theft, no unauthorized possession, no legal basis for impoundment. The car belonged to the trust, and Malcolm Reed was its managing trustee. Officer Price's face changed as he read. It was not dramatic, but it was visible. The confidence he had borrowed from Vanessa drained away, leaving behind the discomfort of a man realizing he had nearly placed handcuffs on an innocent person because someone wealthy had sounded certain. He returned Malcolm's identification with a formality that could not repair the damage, but at least stopped it from growing. The younger officer looked relieved. The security guards looked away. Vanessa refused to surrender. She shifted from accusation to confusion, insisting that the internal Caldwell record still listed the car under corporate hold. Marisol Chen opened her folder. That was the moment Vanessa's fear became unmistakable. Marisol had spent weeks tracing irregular entries across Caldwell's systems. At first, she had believed the problem was sloppy management under pressure from the proposed merger. Then she found the charity transfers. Then, the delayed warranty reimbursements. Then, the executive overrides attached to vehicles used as collateral in internal reports. Finally, that afternoon, she saw the Ferrari record altered less than an hour before Malcolm arrived at the gala. The alteration had not been made by a clerk. It had been made through executive credentials assigned to Vanessa Caldwell's office. The crowd did not understand every technical detail, but they understood enough. They understood that the document Vanessa had used to justify suspicion had been changed from inside her own system. They understood that the man she had accused had shown real paperwork, while she had relied on a record that now looked manufactured. Most of all, they understood that the story they had been recording was not the one they thought. Their phones remained raised, but the mood behind them changed. Curiosity became recognition. Recognition became shame. Vanessa tried to blame Miles. Miles looked as though his soul had left him standing there with a tablet in his hands. For months, he had obeyed her, softened her threats into emails, arranged her meetings, and watched her treat fear as a management tool. Now, with police present and the board chair listening, loyalty became too expensive. He admitted that Vanessa had ordered him to pull the Ferrari's service history and flag it before the gala, claiming she needed leverage over an unnamed trust donor who might oppose the merger. He had not known she would turn that flag into a police accusation. That did not make him innocent, but it made the machinery visible. Bernard Hayes closed his eyes for a moment. Malcolm watched him carefully. Bernard was not a villain, but cowardice in a boardroom can create space for villains to operate. He had allowed Vanessa's aggression because profits had risen. He had accepted her explanations because asking harder questions would have delayed the merger. He had told himself that leadership sometimes required sharp edges. Now those sharp edges had been turned on the very person whose trust kept Caldwell alive. Amina then presented the second set of documents. These were not about the Ferrari. They were about control. The Eleanor Reed Memorial Trust held the controlling interest in Reed Caldwell Holdings, the private entity that owned the majority of Caldwell Prestige Motors. Through that trust, Malcolm Reed possessed the authority Vanessa had spent months pretending she held without limits. He was not a random guest. He was not merely a donor. He was not an outsider trying to impress anyone with a sports car. He was the hidden founder, the principal owner, and the final vote on the merger Vanessa had built her future around. The silence that followed was deeper than the earlier silence. Earlier, people had been quiet because they were waiting to see a man punished. Now they were quiet because they understood. They had watched the owner of the company be treated like a criminal by his own acting CEO. Vanessa stared at Malcolm as if seeing him for the first time made the world unfair to her. That is the strange arrogance of people who judge too quickly. They are not horrified by the harm they caused. They are offended that the person they harmed turned out to have power. In her face, Malcolm saw no real remorse, only calculation collapsing. She was not thinking about the insult to his dignity. She was thinking about the merger bonus slipping away, the board votes dissolving, the headlines forming, and the video evidence spreading faster than her lawyers could contain it. Malcolm finally spoke, but even then, he did not perform anger for the crowd. He made it clear, in a measured way, that the issue had never been whether he could prove he owned the Ferrari. The issue was, what would have happened if he could not? What if he had been a mechanic, borrowing a customer's car with permission? What if he had been a young student from the scholarship program standing beside a vehicle he had been asked to move? What if he had been Jordan, or any worker whose documents were not enough to overcome a powerful person's assumption? Malcolm's calmness forced the crowd to confront the truth Vanessa had tried to hide behind procedure. The problem was not a misunderstanding. It was a system in which certain people were believed first, and others were forced to survive the consequences. Jordan stood near the valet podium, barely breathing. When Malcolm's eyes found him, the young man looked down, ashamed that he had hesitated. Malcolm did not let that shame settle. He acknowledged Jordan's courage in front of everyone, not as a dramatic reward, but as a correction. The first person at that entrance who had tried to protect the truth had not been a board member, an officer, or an executive. It had been a young valet with the most to lose. That fact embarrassed the powerful more than any speech could have. Vanessa attempted one last defense. She claimed she had acted out of concern for company property, but that argument collapsed under its own weight. Amina reminded the officers and the board that concern for property did not explain why Vanessa ignored valid registration, threatened a witness, pushed for impoundment before verification, or used an altered internal record. Marisol added the financial findings. Transfers from the scholarship event budget to consultant accounts tied to the merger campaign, delayed vendor payments hidden under administrative review, and pressure placed on employees who questioned the numbers. The Ferrari incident had exposed the pattern because Vanessa, in her haste to humiliate Malcolm, had reached for the same tools she used everywhere else: intimidation, optics, and manipulated records. Poetic justice does not always arrive with shouting. Sometimes it arrives as a board chair asking for a badge to be surrendered. Bernard removed Vanessa as acting CEO on the spot, pending a formal investigation. The words were quiet, but they struck harder than any public insult she had thrown at Malcolm. The title she had used as a weapon disappeared in front of the same crowd she had tried to impress. Her access to company systems was suspended. The merger vote was postponed indefinitely. The police opened a separate inquiry into the altered record, and the charity fund she had treated as a branding tool was placed under independent protection by the trust she had mocked. Vanessa's face hardened as she realized there would be no graceful exit. Minutes earlier, she had wanted Malcolm removed from the entrance so donors would not feel uncomfortable. Now donors watched as she was escorted away from the gala she had planned to dominate. She had accused Malcolm of not belonging beside the Ferrari. In the end, she was the one who no longer belonged in the building. The same cameras she had welcomed for publicity captured her fall. The same crowd she had tried to command stepped back from her, as though arrogance itself had become contagious. Malcolm did not celebrate. That disappointed some people watching, but it revealed the difference between justice and revenge. Revenge would have demanded humiliation equal to the humiliation Vanessa had attempted. Justice required something more difficult and more lasting. Malcolm wanted the company repaired. He wanted the scholarship protected. He wanted employees free from fear. He wanted the students inside the museum to remember the night, not only as the night a powerful woman was exposed, but as the night a promise survived. The gala did not end. That was Malcolm's decision. Vanessa's removal created chaos, but Malcolm refused to let her failure become the students' punishment. After a delay, the guests were invited back into the main hall. The mood had changed completely. The champagne seemed less important. The speeches sounded thinner. People who had arrived expecting a pleasant evening of charity now carried the uncomfortable knowledge that charity without dignity is only decoration. When Malcolm entered the hall, he did not enter like a conquering hero. He entered slowly, with Jordan beside him and Amina a few steps behind. The red Ferrari remained outside under the lights, no longer a symbol of suspicion, but of everything people had failed to see. Inside the museum, the scholarship applicants watched him with a different kind of attention. Earlier, some had wondered whether they belonged in such a polished room. Now they had seen the man who funded the room nearly thrown out of it. The lesson was painful, but it was also powerful. Belonging, they learned, is not always granted by the people guarding the door. Bernard Hayes took the stage first and admitted, with visible difficulty, that the evening's program had nearly been overshadowed by a failure of leadership. He did not reveal every legal detail, but he acknowledged enough for the room to understand that an apology was owed. Then Malcolm was introduced properly, not as a mysterious donor, not as a trust representative, but as the founder whose principles had shaped Caldwell before ambition distorted them. Some guests applauded too quickly, eager to move from discomfort to redemption. Malcolm let the applause fade before the room could use it to absolve itself. He did not give them the speech they expected. He did not describe his net worth. He did not tell a triumphant story about proving people wrong. Instead, he spoke about Eleanor. He spoke about a woman who believed talent often lives where opportunity refuses to look. He spoke about young mechanics who learn precision from necessity, about students who work night shifts before morning classes, about parents who sacrifice quietly so their children can build something better. He made the room understand that the scholarship was not a public relations gesture. It was a debt paid forward. As he spoke, the meaning of the Ferrari changed again. It was no longer merely a luxury car, or even evidence in a public accusation. It became part of a love story. Malcolm explained, without turning grief into spectacle, that the car carried Eleanor's initials because she had taught him to honor the dreams he once felt embarrassed to admit. She had believed that a boy from a forgotten garage could one day own beauty without apologizing for it. The room grew still, not with scandal this time, but with tenderness. Even those who had recorded his humiliation lowered their phones. The scholarship recipients were announced one by one. Jordan was not on the original list because he had already received support through the technical grant program years earlier. But by the end of the evening, Malcolm expanded the initiative. A new fellowship would be created for working students already inside the automotive industry, young people balancing jobs, training, and family obligations. Jordan would become its first mentor trainee, with full tuition support, paid certification leave, and a permanent position in Caldwell's technical development program if he chose it. The announcement was not charity tossed at him for good behavior. It was recognition of what courage had revealed. In the weeks that followed, the video spread far beyond the city. At first, people shared the most dramatic clip. Vanessa accusing Malcolm, the police lights flashing against the Ferrari, the moment Amina arrived with documents. But as longer footage emerged, the conversation changed. Viewers noticed Jordan trying to speak. They noticed Malcolm offering paperwork again and again. They noticed how quickly the crowd believed suspicion when it was spoken by someone expensive. The story became bigger than a Ferrari, bigger than a CEO losing her title, bigger even than one man's vindication. It became a mirror. Caldwell Prestige Motors underwent a reckoning. Malcolm did not burn the company down. He rebuilt its foundation in public. The proposed merger was canceled. An independent audit confirmed misuse of event funds and improper manipulation of internal records. Vanessa faced civil claims, regulatory scrutiny, and the permanent collapse of the image she had curated so carefully. Miles cooperated with investigators and was dismissed from his role. Bernard Hayes resigned from the board after admitting that oversight had failed under his leadership. Marisol Chen was appointed interim president, not because she was flawless, but because she had chosen the truth when silence would have protected her career. The company changed in ways that mattered. Employees received a protected channel for reporting misconduct. Valet workers, porters, mechanics, and junior staff were included in dignity and escalation policies that were not just printed in handbooks, but enforced. Customer contracts were rewritten in plain language. Warranty claims were reviewed. The scholarship fund was expanded and placed under a separate board that included educators, technicians, and former recipients. Malcolm insisted that the people most often ignored by luxury businesses should have a voice in how those businesses measured integrity. As for the Ferrari, Malcolm kept driving it, but not often. He brought it to the museum once each year for the scholarship ceremony, parking it not behind velvet ropes, but near the student entrance, where young people could see it up close. He allowed them to ask questions about the engine, the design, the balance between power and control. He loved those questions because they came from curiosity, not envy. He wanted them to understand that beauty did not belong only to those born near it. It could be studied, built, earned, and honored. 1 year after the incident, a small plaque was installed at the Meridian Auto Museum beside the scholarship wall. It bore Eleanor Reed's name, Malcolm Reed's name, and a sentence simple enough to be remembered by everyone who passed it. It said that dignity is the first door opportunity must open. Malcolm stood before that plaque for a long time after the ceremony ended. No cameras surrounded him then. No crowd demanded a reaction. Jordan, now wearing a technician's jacket instead of a valet uniform, stood nearby and said nothing, because some moments are too full for speech. Malcolm thought about the night Vanessa tried to reduce him to a suspect beside his own car. He thought about the officers, the crowd, the phones, the silence. He thought about how close the truth had come to being delayed by confidence, title, and assumption. He knew that his wealth had helped protect him. His attorney had arrived. His documents had been recognized. His ownership had been too large to ignore. But he also knew that many people never get that kind of rescue. Their truth is smaller on paper, easier to dismiss, and less profitable for strangers to defend. That knowledge kept him humble. It also kept him working. Vanessa eventually faded from headlines, though consequences followed her longer than attention did. She tried to rebuild her reputation through carefully worded statements about stress, misunderstanding, and procedural confusion. But the public had seen too much. More importantly, investigators had seen enough. The world she had built out of image could not survive contact with evidence. For a woman who had valued reputation above character, the punishment was brutally fitting. She had spent years polishing a name while neglecting the truth beneath it. In the end, the name tarnished exactly where the truth had been ignored. Malcolm never said he forgave her publicly. He also never let bitterness become his legacy. Eleanor had taught him that justice should protect the future, not merely punish the past. So he chose to build. He built scholarships. He built protections. He built a company where a young worker could challenge an executive without risking everything. He built the kind of door he wished had opened more easily when he was young. And the red Ferrari remained what it had always been, no matter what Vanessa tried to make it. Not proof of arrogance, not an invitation to envy, not a symbol that one man had become better than anyone else. It was a promise kept. It was a reminder that a boy who once fixed engines under weak garage lights had lived long enough to honor the woman who believed in him. It was also a warning to anyone who judged ownership by appearance, intelligence by accent, dignity by clothing, or worth by the comfort of their assumptions. Because sometimes the quiet man beside the car is not lost. Sometimes he is not lucky. Sometimes he's not trying to impress anyone at all. Sometimes he is the one who built the road, paid for the lights, opened the doors, and still waits patiently to see who will treat him with respect before they know his name. So the next time you see someone standing where you do not expect them to stand, pause before you turn your assumption into a sentence over their life. The truth does not become smaller because it arrives quietly. Dignity does not disappear because someone powerful refuses to recognize it. And kindness, when protected by courage, can outlast arrogance every single time. If this story reminded you that no one should have to prove their humanity before being treated with respect, leave a like. Share it with someone who needs the reminder. And tell us in the comments whether you think Malcolm gave Vanessa exactly the justice she deserved. 3 hours before the Saravan Cultural Council arrived to challenge Arden Museum's ownership, the museum's brightest scholars were losing a battle against a piece of clay.
We cannot let the council see uncertainty.
Then a soaked 17-year-old girl walked into the lobby, carrying a torn backpack and a volunteer application. Her name was Nadia Reyes.
Are you here for the shelter referral program?
Nadia shook her head. She had not come to ask for help. She had seen a flyer and came to apply as a volunteer.
No, I saw a flyer and came to apply as a volunteer.
But when she glanced at the digital scan of the ancient charter, her expression changed. She stepped closer to the screen.
That tablet is upside down.
The scholars turned toward Nadia in disbelief. Dr. Julian Mercer noticed her claim, not with curiosity, but with immediate contempt.
You are saying every scholar in this building has been reading it wrong?
Dr. Mercer asked where exactly she had learned to read a language trained experts had struggled with for years.
And where exactly did you learn what trained experts could not?
Nadia tightened her grip on her backpack. Then she answered that her mother had taught her everything she knew.
My mother taught me.
Then Nadia looked directly at Mercer and said the name he had hoped never to hear again, Elena Reyes.
Elena Reyes.
For the first time that morning, Dr. Julian Mercer looked afraid. The lobby became so quiet that Nadia could hear rain striking the windows. Mercer called Elena a former employee who had worked briefly as a restoration technician, trying to make Nadia's mother sound insignificant.
Your mother worked here briefly. That is all.
Nadia said the writing was not meant to be read from left to right, and that the marks along the edge were directional guides.
Those marks are not cracks. They tell you where to begin.
Nadia explained that the sentence began at the border and curved inward. Her mother had given that route a name Mercer clearly recognized.
My mother called it the Guardian's Path.
My mother called it the Guardian's Path, Nadia said. The phrase landed heavily. Mercer's expression tightened before he could stop it. The Guardian's Path. It was not a phrase a teenager would have invented. It was not something she could have guessed from a quick glance at the screen. Elena had used those exact words in her notes. They had appeared in the report Mercer had hoped would disappear forever. The junior scholars gathered closer to the monitor. One enlarged the lower border. Another brought up older scans. A third began comparing the marks against a database of known Saravan inscriptions. Their movements became slower and more deliberate. The confidence they had shown before Nadia entered the lobby had begun to dissolve. For weeks, they had been trapped inside one interpretation. They had assumed the tablet was a sale agreement because the museum had always called it one. They had assumed the first line named an owner because every exhibition label, donor brochure, and academic summary said it did. They had not tested the possibility that the first line was being read in reverse. Evelyn Hart noticed the shift. She had been standing near the reception desk moments earlier, balancing a phone call from the board with messages from legal counsel and a growing stack of problems that no one else seemed willing to solve. Evelyn was not a historian. She did not claim to understand ancient languages. Her work was more immediate and less romantic. She managed budgets, staff conflicts, insurance concerns, donors, building permits, public relations disasters, and the 1,000 small emergencies that kept Arden Museum functioning. But she understood risk, and the silence around the research screen was beginning to sound like risk. She ended her call and stepped closer. Her eyes moved from the tablet to Nadia, then from Nadia to Mercer. She asked whether the reading direction had ever been tested, using the border marks as guides. No one answered immediately. That hesitation mattered. Mercer stepped in before the silence became too revealing. He said the team had examined all reasonable possibilities. He reminded Evelyn that the document had been studied by senior experts from several institutions. He warned that a museum facing an international legal challenge could not allow an unverified theory to disrupt months of preparation. He sounded calm, but he was speaking too quickly. Nadia saw it. Owen Blake saw it too. Owen was the security guard who had opened the side entrance for Nadia less than an hour earlier. At first, he had thought she had come inside to get out of the rain. Her jacket was old, her shoes were soaked, and the backpack on her shoulder looked as though it had been repaired more times than most people repaired anything. He had almost sent her away. Now he stood near the edge of the lobby, watching the museum's most respected scholar become unsettled by a phrase from an old notebook. Owen did not know the difference between a trade agreement and a custodial covenant. He did not understand Saravan grammar or ancient border signs, but he knew how people behaved when they were trying to hide fear beneath authority. Nadia continued before Mercer could close the conversation. She explained that the opening symbols did not appear to describe a sale. The grammar was wrong for that. If the border marks were followed, the first sequence became a declaration of protection. The document seemed to describe an object placed into another party's care. It sounded less like ownership and more like responsibility. That difference changed everything. A sale would mean Arden Museum had a legal claim to the relic connected to the charter. A guardianship agreement would mean the museum had only been trusted with it. And if that trust came with conditions, the museum could lose much more than an artifact. It could lose the story it had told the world for generations. The Saravan Cultural Council had spent years arguing exactly that. Their historians believed the relic had never been sold. Their legal advisors believed the museum's claim rested on a mistranslation. Their community had watched as an object tied to their own history, ceremonies, and ancestors became a centerpiece in a foreign institution. The council was not coming to Art and Museum for a polite visit. They were coming to demand answers. Mercer knew that better than anyone. He also knew that if Nadia's interpretation was correct, the charter could become evidence against him. He tried to dismiss her without appearing cruel. He said that ancient texts were filled with ambiguity. He suggested that memories of a parent's research could become distorted over time. He described Nadia's observations as interesting, but incomplete, the kind of thing that should be left to trained professionals. To anyone who did not know him, it might have sounded reasonable, but Nadia heard the message beneath it. You do not belong in this room. You do not understand what you are touching. You should be grateful that we are even listening. For a moment, she felt the old instinct disappear. She had felt it in school when teachers saw the name of the youth shelter on her records. She had felt it at social service offices when adults spoke over her as though she were a problem waiting to be processed. She had felt it at job interviews when people looked at her carefully repaired shoes and decided not to ask another question. Her mother had once told her that poor people were often expected to be grateful just for being allowed inside a room. But Elena had also told her something else. When someone becomes uncomfortable because of a question, that question is usually worth asking. Nadia opened her backpack. Inside was an old leather notebook. The cover had cracked at the corners. Several pages were held together by faded thread. The notebook had traveled with Nadia through every difficult year after her mother died. It had survived moves, shelters, temporary rooms, donated furniture, and nights when Nadia slept with it beneath her pillow because she was afraid someone might take it. To anyone else, it was only a worn book. To Nadia, it was the closest thing she had to hearing her mother's voice again. She opened it carefully. The pages were filled with copied symbols, restoration sketches, arrows, questions, and notes written in Elena Reyes's neat, steady handwriting. Some of the pages showed the Saravan Charter from different angles. Others contained close studies of the border marks. One page held a rough drawing of a narrow triangular fragment, its edges covered with small symbols. Near the bottom, Elena had written 3 words. Third fragment missing. Mercer saw the page, and this time his reaction was impossible to miss. His face did not collapse. He did not confess. He did not make the kind of mistake people made in dramatic stories when fear became too large to hide. Instead, he went still. For a man like Mercer, stillness was more revealing than panic. Owen saw it first. Evelyn saw it next. The junior scholars looked from the notebook to Mercer, unsure why a few handwritten words had changed the entire mood of the room. Nadia explained that her mother had always believed the charter was incomplete. The main tablet contained the beginning and central terms of the agreement, but not the final condition. Without that ending, the document could be interpreted in ways that benefited the people holding it. But Elena had believed a third fragment existed, and she had believed it contained the part that mattered most. Mercer dismissed the notebook as private material with no official authority. He said that scattered notes and old sketches could not be treated as evidence. Then he turned toward Owen and instructed him to escort Nadia out of the museum. The command was quiet, direct, and final. It was the kind of order Mercer had given many times before. Most people obeyed him because they knew what happened when they did not. Careers could stall, invitations could disappear, research funding could dry up. A single bad impression from the head of a department could follow a person for years. But Owen did not move. He had spent most of his working life following instructions. Security work taught people to respect procedure. You checked badges, you followed the chain of command, you kept order. You did not insert yourself into conversations that belonged to people with more education, more money, or more authority. But as Owen looked at Nadia holding her mother's notebook, he understood that this was not about procedure. It was about whether someone with less power deserved to be heard. "I think we should verify her claim first," he said. The sentence was simple, but it changed the room. Mercer turned toward him with open irritation. A security guard was not supposed to interrupt an academic dispute. He was supposed to stand near the door and remain invisible. Owen did not look away. Evelyn made the decision before Mercer could respond. She said Nadia would stay. No one would remove her from the building. No documents connected to Elena Reyes would be taken out of the museum. And no final presentation would be given to the Cerevan Council until the old research records had been reviewed. Mercer tried to protest. Evelyn stopped him. She took the notebook from Nadia and studied the sketch of the triangular fragment. The shape appeared to fit along the lower edge of the Cerevan Charter. Elena's handwriting was old, but the detail was precise. This was not the careless scribbling of someone guessing at a mystery. It was the work of a person who had spent long hours looking at something everyone else had ignored. Then another folded page slipped from the notebook. It fell onto the marble floor. Owen bent down and picked it up. The paper had yellowed with age. Most of it had been torn away, leaving only the bottom section intact. But that was enough. At the lower edge was a red administrative note. Further review suspended pending departmental authorization. Below it was a signature, Dr. Julian Mercer. Owen handed the page to Evelyn. She read it once, then again. Mercer said the report had been preliminary. He said Elena had raised questions that could not be proven at the time. He said the department had been under pressure. The evidence had been incomplete, and the suspension had been a normal professional decision. But his explanation did not answer the real question. Why had the review been suspended instead of completed? Why had the final pages gone missing? Why had the museum continued to present the charter as proof of ownership after one of its own researchers raised doubts? And why had Mercer reacted with fear when Nadia mentioned the third fragment? Evelyn looked at the old note in her hand. Then she asked Owen to take Nadia to the archive room beneath the museum. The archive was not part of the public Arden Museum. Visitors saw marble floors, bright galleries, climate-controlled display cases, and carefully chosen labels. The archive was where the less polished history lived. It sat below the galleries behind gray doors and narrow corridors. Metal shelves held old photographs, personnel files, maintenance records, restoration logs, rejected reports, and documents that had not been touched in years. It smelled of dust, paper, cardboard, and cold metal. For Nadia, it felt strangely familiar. Her mother had once worked in rooms like that. Not under gallery lights, not beside wealthy donors. In spaces where people handled broken objects, sorted fragments, and tried to restore what time had damaged. Owen switched on the lights. Rows of shelves stretched ahead of them. At first, Nadia found only small traces of Elena. Her name appeared in old staff rosters, payroll forms, inventory lists, and repair schedules. She was described as a technician, an assistant, a support employee. Never a researcher. Never a contributor. Never someone who had asked questions important enough to threaten the museum's official story. The absence hurt more than Nadia expected. It was one thing to know that her mother had been dismissed. It was another to see how completely her work had been erased. Owen searched through boxes marked with old project names. Nadia moved slowly between cabinets, checking dates and labels. The Saravan Charter had been studied in several phases over the years. The museum had recorded every restoration material, every temperature change, every crack, every photograph. Yet somehow, the final fragment had vanished from the story. Then Nadia found a photograph. It had been taken during an excavation exhibit opening 12 years earlier. Dr. Mercer stood near the center, younger but instantly recognizable, smiling beside donors, visiting scholars, and senior museum officials. Near the edge of the picture, almost cut off by the frame, stood Elena Reyes. She was holding a padded tray. On the tray were several clay fragments. One of them was narrow and triangular. Nadia placed the photograph beside the sketch from her mother's notebook. The shapes matched. The third fragment had existed. It had been found with the charter, and at some point, it had been removed from the official record. Owen searched another shelf and found a large storage box labeled Saravan Restoration Project, 2014 to 2016. Inside were folders of condition reports, photographs, correspondence, and maintenance forms. Several gaps appeared where files should have been. Empty spaces between folders suggested that someone had removed documents long ago. But at the bottom of the box, beneath a stack of old storage logs, Owen found an envelope. Elena Reyes's handwriting covered the front. Nadia stared at it for several seconds before touching it. The envelope had survived 12 years in the museum's basement. It had survived staff changes, renovations, storage moves, and whatever effort had been made to erase Elena's work. Somehow, it had remained hidden among files no one thought important enough to destroy. Inside was a partial report. The first page carried Elena's name. The second page described the same border marks Nadia had identified in the lobby. The third page argued that the charter might be a custodial agreement rather than a transfer of ownership. The fourth page mentioned a detached fragment that could contain the final condition of the covenant. And at the bottom, in the same red ink, was the same instruction. Further review suspended. Nadia read the pages again and again. The words were not dramatic. Elena had not written with anger. She had written carefully, professionally, and with the restraint of someone who knew that evidence mattered more than emotion. But between the lines, Nadia could see her mother's loneliness. Elena had been right. She had known something was wrong. She had tried to tell people with the authority to investigate. And someone had made sure the investigation stopped. Nadia thought about the last years of her mother's life. After losing her job at Arden Museum, Elena had taken whatever work she could find. She restored damaged books for a small shop across town. She cleaned offices at night. She repaired old furniture. She translated simple letters and labels for community groups. She never returned to academic conferences. She never received another museum position. She became quieter, more tired, and more careful about what she said. But she never stopped studying. Some nights, Nadia would wake up and see light beneath the kitchen door. Her mother would be sitting at the table with a cup of cold tea, copying symbols into the leather notebook. She had never spoken much about Mercer. She had never explained exactly why she had been forced out. But once, when Nadia was still young, she had asked why her mother kept working on something that had already caused so much pain. Elena had looked up from the page and said, "The truth does not stop being true, just because powerful people are tired of hearing it." Nadia had been too young to understand. Standing in the archive room with the report in her hands, she understood at last. Evelyn arrived a few minutes later. She had been trying to keep the museum from falling apart upstairs. The Saravan Council's cars had already been seen outside. Board members were gathering in the reception hall. The legal team had asked for an update. Donors were beginning to notice that the scheduled presentation had been delayed. But when Evelyn read Elena's report, the urgent noise of the building seemed to fade. She read it once as an administrator looking for liability. Then she read it again as a person trying to understand how an institution had allowed one woman's work to disappear. The report was not reckless. It was not speculative in the careless sense Mercer had claimed. Elena had documented her observations. She had included comparative references. She had outlined what needed to be tested. She had not demanded that the museum surrender the relic immediately. She had simply asked for the truth to be examined. Evelyn looked at Nadia. For the first time that day, Nadia was no longer an unwanted visitor, a shelter girl, or an inconvenience at the worst possible moment. She was the only person in the building carrying evidence everyone else had ignored. A message came through Evelyn's phone. The Saravan Cultural Council had arrived, and somewhere inside Arden Museum, hidden beneath a false label or a forgotten display case, was the missing fragment that could expose everything Julian Mercer had spent 12 years trying to bury. The Saravan Cultural Council entered Arden Museum without anger, spectacle, or raised voices. They did not need any of those things. Their presence alone unsettled the building. The delegation included historians, preservation specialists, legal advisors, and Professor Layla Rahman, one of the most respected scholars of ancient Saravan language and law. They had traveled for years through archives, private collections, old shipping documents, and the scattered records of expeditions that had removed objects from their homeland. For generations, people from Saravan had watched museums around the world display pieces of their culture. Sacred objects had been taken from temples, burial sites, family archives, and ceremonial grounds. They had been transported across oceans, assigned new catalog numbers, placed beneath foreign lighting, and described in languages their creators would never have recognized. The world often called that preservation, but preservation without consent could become another form of theft. The Saravan Council had come to Arden Museum because the charter mattered. It was not only a tablet, it was the legal memory of an agreement made during a time of violence and uncertainty. The relic connected to it had been treated as a trophy by the museum, but to the Saravan people, it was something else entirely. It represented continuity. It represented survival. It represented a promise made by their ancestors that no institution had the right to rewrite. Dr. Mercer greeted the delegation in the reception hall with the calm professionalism that had made him famous. His voice was smooth. His posture was controlled. He intended to lead them into the presentation room, show them the museum's official interpretation, and reassure the board that everything remained under control. But Evelyn interrupted before the briefing could begin. She informed the council that new archival material had been discovered and that the museum could not ethically present a final translation until the evidence had been reviewed. Mercer's frustration appeared only briefly. To most people, he still looked composed. But Layla Rahman noticed. She had spent decades working with scholars, collectors, politicians, and museum leaders. She knew the difference between uncertainty and concealment. She knew when a person was trying to protect truth and when a person was trying to protect a reputation. Then she saw the old leather notebook in Nadia's hands. Layla stopped walking. Her eyes moved to the cracked cover, then to the faint handwriting visible on the open page. For a moment, her expression changed from professional caution to something more personal. "Elena Reyes," she said quietly. I knew her name. Nadia looked up. The room seemed to narrow around those words. Years earlier, before Elena had been forced out of Arden Museum, she had contacted Professor Layla Rahman. Elena had asked questions about the structure of old Saravan custodial agreements. She had sent a short letter describing the border marks on the charter. Layla had replied with several sources and asked for more photographs. Then the correspondence stopped. Layla had never known why. She had assumed Elena had been discouraged. She had assumed the museum had chosen a different direction. She had assumed, as people often assumed when someone disappeared quietly from an institution, that the person must have made a mistake. Now, seeing Nadia, the notebook, and the partial report, Layla understood what had really happened. Elena had been silenced. Nadia showed her the report from the archive, the old photograph, and the sketch of the triangular fragment. Layla examined them carefully. She did not rush to make a grand claim. She asked questions. She compared dates. She looked at the handwriting. She studied the directional markings drawn by Elena beside the tablet. Then she said that the evidence deserved to be taken seriously. That was enough. For the first time, Mercer was no longer controlling the conversation. Nadia remembered another detail from the notebook. The sketch of the missing fragment had been drawn beside a rough outline of the museum's upper gallery. Her mother had written a short sentence beneath it, one Nadia had never fully understood. The final promise was moved where no one would think to read it. Nadia thought of the photograph she had found in the archive. Behind Elena and Mercer, almost hidden by the group of donors, had been a familiar display case. It stood in the upper gallery beside a bronze ceremonial mask. Nadia remembered seeing it years ago when her mother had once brought her to the museum before everything changed. The clue had been there all along. The group moved toward the upper gallery. Mercer tried to stop them without seeming like he was stopping them. He argued that the museum should follow established procedure. He said the council should not be drawn into an internal archival disagreement. He suggested that the search for a missing fragment could take days, perhaps weeks, and that it would be irresponsible to make conclusions before the proper team had examined every record. But his argument only made Evelyn more certain. A man who believed the fragment did not matter would not be trying so hard to delay the search. The upper gallery was quieter than the rest of the museum. Most visitors had been redirected because of the unexpected meeting. Rain darkened the tall windows, turning the city outside into a blurred gray landscape. The bronze ceremonial mask sat behind glass at the center of the room, its surface reflecting faint gold light. Beside it was a small display case containing several fragments that had been labeled as decorative objects of uncertain origin. One of them was triangular. It was smaller than Nadia expected. Smaller than the fear it had caused. Smaller than the years of silence built around it. It rested on dark velvet beneath a short museum label that made it sound meaningless. Decorative clay fragment, origin uncertain. Nadia stood before the glass and felt something cold move through her chest. For 12 years, the truth had been sitting in plain sight. Visitors had walked past it. Scholars had walked past it. Donors had walked past it. Mercer had walked past it every day, knowing exactly what it was. The conservator carefully opened the case. The fragment was removed and placed beside a high-resolution image of the Saravan Charter. The shape aligned with the lower border. The clay composition looked similar. The small directional marks along one edge matched the signs Nadia had identified on the main tablet. Professor Layla leaned closer. Then she looked at Nadia. "It fits," she said. The words carried through the gallery. Mercer immediately tried to dismiss the discovery. He said that fragments could be misleading. He said that similar clay did not establish legal meaning. He said that objects from the same region could resemble each other without belonging together. But Evelyn had already requested the old catalog records. A staff member arrived with digital copies from the museum database. The history of the triangular fragment appeared on the screen. Years earlier, it had been listed as part of the Saravan Restoration Project. Then, 11 years before, its catalog number had been changed. Its link to the charter had been removed. Its classification had been rewritten. Instead of a missing section of a legal tablet, it had become a decorative fragment of uncertain origin. The authorization belonged to Dr. Julian Mercer. This time, no explanation could make the fact disappear. The fragment was taken to the research wing under the supervision of the conservator, Layla, Evelyn, and members of the Saravan Council. The charter was brought from its secure case and placed beneath specialized imaging equipment. Scholars gathered around the monitors. Lawyers stood near the doorway. Board members arrived quietly, their faces pale as they realized the museum's crisis was no longer private. Nadia stood at the edge of the room with her mother's notebook held against her chest. The same people who had ignored her in the lobby were now waiting for the evidence she had led them to reveal itself. At first, the scan showed only dark clay, scratches, and the cloudy residue of an old protective coating. The conservator adjusted the lighting frequency. The image sharpened slowly. A faint line appeared, then another. Then a sequence of symbols emerged beneath the surface, running along the narrow edge of the fragment. The room became completely still. The missing ending had been found. Professor Layla did not translate immediately. She examined the image with care. She compared the symbols to the border marks on the main charter. She followed the Guardian's path Nadia had identified. She corrected the orientation. She checked the grammar against old Saravan legal forms. It was not a miracle. It was evidence finally being allowed to speak. The charter did not describe the sacred relic as something purchased. It did not grant permanent ownership to anyone outside the Saravan community. It described the relic as an entrusted object, placed in the care of guardians during a period of danger. Those guardians had a duty to preserve it. They had a duty to protect it. And when recognized representatives of the Saravan people came forward to request its return, the agreement required the guardians to give it back. Then Layla reached the final sentence. Her voice softened as she translated the last words. The guardian who conceals this covenant, alters its meaning, or refuses the rightful return, forfeits all claim to hold what was never theirs. The words settled over the room like a verdict. The Arden Museum had never owned the relic. It had only been trusted with it, and its right to hold it had ended the moment it chose secrecy over truth. No one spoke for several seconds. The members of the Saravan Council stood quietly before the monitor. Their faces carried emotions that did not need explanation. Some looked angry. Some looked exhausted. One older historian closed his eyes, as though he had spent years waiting for the chance to hear those words spoken aloud. For them, the translation was not only a legal victory, it was proof that their ancestors had not been forgotten. The agreement had survived. The language had survived. The truth had survived, even after generations of people tried to bury it beneath labels, glass cases, and institutional certainty. Nadia looked toward Mercer. She remembered how he had looked at her when she first entered the lobby. He had seen a wet jacket, worn shoes, a torn backpack, and a girl from a shelter. He had assumed that was enough information to decide whether she mattered. He had thought he could dismiss her with polished words. He had thought Elena's name had been erased. He had thought the fragment was hidden safely behind a false label. But now the entire room was looking at him. Evelyn stepped forward with Elena's report in her hands. "Dr. Mercer, you are suspended pending an independent investigation." Mercer tried to argue that the museum could not make such a decision based on a single translation. He claimed that the council was interpreting incomplete evidence. He insisted that catalog changes could have administrative explanations. He tried to make the truth sound complicated again, because complication had protected him for years. But the evidence was no longer a single translation. It was 12 years of hidden reports. It was altered catalog records. It was a missing fragment reclassified under his authorization. It was Elena's research. It was Nadia's notebook. It was the fear on his face every time someone came too close to what he had done. No one came to defend him. The scholars who had once treated him as untouchable stood in silence. The board members avoided his eyes. The legal team began collecting documents. The Saravan Council watched with the calm dignity of people who had waited too long for the truth to be acknowledged. Mercer's career did not collapse because he lacked intelligence. It collapsed because he believed intelligence gave him the right to decide which truths mattered. He had silenced Elena because she had less power than he did. He had buried her work because it threatened his reputation. He had hidden the fragment because it threatened the museum's claim. And he had dismissed Nadia because he believed a girl from a shelter could never challenge a man with titles, money, and influence. But the truth had returned through the daughter of the woman he tried to erase. The investigation that followed was larger than anyone expected. Arden Museum announced a complete independent review of the Saravan collection. The sacred relic was removed from public display and placed under joint care, while arrangements were made for its return. The museum agreed to work with the Saravan Cultural Council to review every artifact connected to the original expedition. More documents were found in the weeks that followed. There were internal emails showing that Mercer had discouraged staff from revisiting Elena's work. There were catalog revisions with no proper explanation. There were notes from meetings where concerns about ownership had been minimized because donors had invested heavily in the Saravan exhibit. Mercer had not acted alone in every decision, but he had been the person with the power to make silence look official. His suspension became permanent. His academic appointments were reviewed. His published work was questioned. The museum removed his name from several public materials while the investigation continued. The punishment was not dramatic in the way people expected from stories. There was no public shouting. No one dragged him through the lobby. No one needed to. The truth did something more lasting. It took away the authority he had used to control others. The museum issued a public correction. Elena Reyes's name was restored to the official history of the Saravan Charter. Her report was digitized, preserved, and acknowledged as the first internal research to identify the document as a custodial covenant rather than a transfer of ownership. For years, her work had existed only in a worn notebook and a hidden envelope. Now it became part of the record. A research grant was created in Elena Reyes's name for young people from underrepresented communities who wanted to study history, languages, preservation, archaeology, and cultural heritage. The museum's board did not create the grant because it could erase the past. Nothing could do that. They created it because the future had to become different. Nadia did not become rich overnight. She did not suddenly appear on magazine covers or receive a perfect new life from strangers who had ignored her before. That would not have been honest. Her problems did not disappear, because one day changed everything. But the day did change the direction of her life. She received a paid internship with the joint Sarivan-Arden Preservation Project. The position came with transportation support, educational guidance, and stable housing assistance through a youth transition program. For the first time in a long time, Nadia had a place to go that did not feel temporary. She also had a future that did not depend on someone else deciding she belonged. Professor Layla became one of her mentors. She did not treat Nadia as a miracle or a symbol. She treated her as a young person with knowledge, patience, and a deep connection to the work her mother had begun. She taught Nadia how to verify evidence, how to question assumptions, and how to let facts speak louder than anger. Nadia listened carefully, but she never forgot the lesson she had already learned from Elena. Sometimes the most important thing a person can do is refuse to let the truth become invisible. Months later, Nadia returned to the archive room beneath Arden Museum. The room still smelled of dust, paper, and old metal shelves, but it no longer felt like a place where forgotten stories were buried. A new workstation had been set up near the window. There were digitization tools, preservation folders, and neatly labeled boxes waiting to be cataloged. Nadia entered with her own identification badge. This time, she did not come through the side door hoping someone would let her stay. She belonged there. On her desk sat her mother's old leather notebook beside a new archival folder. The label read, Elena Reyes Collection. Nadia opened the notebook to the first page. There, in faded handwriting, was a sentence her mother had written years before. The truth is often hidden in the part everyone else ignores. For years, Nadia had thought those words were only about old symbols and forgotten documents. Now she understood that they were about people too. They were about the quiet worker no one bothered to credit. They were about the poor girl no one thought was worth listening to. They were about the community whose history had been carried away and renamed by strangers. They were about the small fragment everyone walked past because they had already decided it could not matter. The world often judges people by clothes, titles, money, addresses, and appearances. But wisdom does not always arrive wearing the shape people expect. Sometimes it comes carrying a torn backpack. Sometimes it stands quietly in the rain. And sometimes, the person everyone overlooks is the one carrying the truth that changes everything.